So it's 7 p.m. on February 16th, 2022. And we will have a roll call for board members who are present at this meeting. So Daryl Beardsley, present.
Matt Beavers, present.
Lisa Camp, present.
And I saw Rebecca, but it looks like she might have dropped off. So Matt Vitale present.
Yeah, saw the same, Matt.
Yeah, I think her phone is still on, but. Okay, so Rebecca, when you get on, you can announce yourself. Okay, so we have a variance hearing at 7:30, and we have some scheduled discussions and a number of other items of business. But first, I'd just like to announce any items to be added as not reasonably anticipated by the chair 48 hours in advance of the meeting. And we can decide whether to amend the agenda. So one is for a 2020 food establishment permit renewal for St. Teresa'S. Does anyone have anything else to potentially add? Oh.
So moved.
Seconded.
I'll second. Or Matt.
Either way.
Okay, so Daryl, aye.
Matt Beavers, aye.
Lisa, I.
And not hearing Rebecca, Matt Vitale, aye.
Hey, Rebecca, I see your name, but can you hear us? Oops, no, I don't.
And I see that DeFrancesco is here, I think, for Gunnar, and I sort of wonder if we can quickly take care of that as we dive into topics that are likely to be a bit meatier. Does that
Yes,
sound
that
reasonable
was
to folks?
the first one I wanted to tackle so that they don't have to wait. And just a moment, Rebecca might be coming in just a second.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see if we can just get her connected into the meeting. So Rebecca, are you able to unmute and just announce that you're present?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, with a lot of feedback.
I'll hang up the phone as soon as you can hear me. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Just announce that you're present officially per our roll call. Uh-oh, maybe not. Okay, so then let's move on to, where is this here? We put this off from the other week. Ah, here we go. The application for rabies vaccination exemption.
Mm-hmm.
And the DeFrancesco's are here because protection of the public from rabies is obviously something quite important to the Board of Health. And
Can you hear me now?
yes, but again, there's a lot of feedback or something happening.
Rebecca, if you join by phone, you can't also have audio on the computer.
I understand. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. Sorry about the complications.
Okay. And we just wanted to go over a few things. Sorry to backtrack a bit, but of what it means, what obligations a pet owner takes on when there's a potential for rabies vaccination exemption. And some of these things are highlighted here. And I assume that you've had a chance to read it because you did sign it. But again, I think a lot of people in town are going to assume that animals have been vaccinated. And so we want extra precautions because really, if someone gets rabies, if you actually get rabies, there is no cure. So
Sure.
it is quite serious, and certainly one of the doctors could address this further. But there are a few, I think, important things here. One is here, exempted animals shall not be allowed outdoors without being on a leash and muzzled, and shall be under the direct physical control of an adult owner at all times. So I just want to highlight that as certainly an extra requirement. And are you comfortable? DeFrancisco's, are you
Yes.
comfortable
sure.
with that?
I mean, we have a large fenced-in yard with a 6-foot-high chain link fence in our yard. So, I mean, nobody can really get to him and animals or anything else. So, I mean, he's good. He's pretty old. He doesn't get around well anymore. We have to help him get him up and stuff like that. He's got a little bit of a limp. And he's old. He's 14 now. So, you know, he's getting there. But, yeah, then we have no problem with that. Put him on a leash. I've always had him on a leash anyways, anytime I've taken him for a walk. But he doesn't go for long walks anymore. It's pretty much just short walks around the yard.
Okay.
About it.
And does the fence protect him from contact with wild animals who could potentially?
Yeah, I mean, that was the main reason we put the fence up. We have a Chihuahua also, and you know, we didn't want any coyotes or anything else trying to get to them. So that was one of the reasons. We've had other dogs before with these guys. They're gone now, but that was one of the main reasons why we have a large fence.
Okay. And certainly, you know, and again, maybe Matt Beaver, since you've actually dealt with rabies patients.
And
human
Rebecca,
patients.
can you just go on mute if you're going to say something totally fine, but otherwise there's still some feedback there.
Okay, so Matt, as a
Sure. Yeah, happy to comment. I think that I appreciate that you guys are trying to sort of make the right choice here for your pet, and I appreciate you coming to sort of review all this with us. The comment I generally have here is that I've taken care of a couple people with rabies, and it's essentially universally fatal, and that's why it's so important to vaccinate people. And not people, animals. I've also been exposed myself, so I've been vaccinated. But in general, most people are not vaccinated. So I think the point I usually like to make here is that in general, just sort of having cancer isn't a contraindication because they're inactivated or recombinant vaccines, and so sort of immune differences or cancer aren't in and of itself a contraindication. And so I just want to sort of make sure you're aware of that in making this decision not to vaccinate. And then just making sure you're aware of all the extra requirements.
Yes.
Oh, definitely, yes.
Then Rebecca, did you want to see your hand up? Did you want to add something, Rebecca? Maybe not. Okay.
okay. Does anyone else have any
I would like
comments?
to add something. Can you
Okay.
hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I also would like to echo that. I'm not sure if you understand that the animals that can carry rabies and that can catch rabies would be able to bite your dog on a leash because your dog would not be able to escape. And I think it's very serious neurologic condition. It's not only fatal for the animal, but it's fatal for any other animal that comes in contact with the animal who is exposed or contracts rabies. The reason that it's mandated at the state level is because of the seriousness of it, and it is a true public health concern. I don't really understand. I actually was planning to call your vet because I don't really understand why your dog, in spite of having cancer, would have the ability to mount an antibody response, which would protect the animal against rabies and the spread of disease. And it could potentially be a very serious life-threatening condition. So I think that it would be worth discussing it further. I don't really understand. Was it you who didn't want to have it, or was it your vet who recommended that it would be unsafe?
It was the vet that it was the vet that recommended that we don't get that he doesn't have rabies because of his. He was supposedly They told us he was going to pass away about not a year ago, but almost a year ago. And
Mm.
he's hung on, but he's not in great shape. I mean, I don't know how much longer he'll be alive. So I think that was one of the reasons why she just was like, we don't want to give him any more vaccines or any more any kind of shots or anything like that. She was worried about what they might do to him at this point, but we don't know how much longer he'll be around. He's old and he's getting there. So maybe that was her reasoning. I'm not sure what it was other than that.
Yeah, they told us that he was going to pass away a year ago, and they said it could be any time now, and he doesn't get around at all. He's basically on hospice at home. So
Oh,
he's
sorry.
he's only, in our yard, really.
To go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
And that's on a leash always, just for his safety, so we can help him because he can't walk around very well, and we have to lift him up and all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
He doesn't go up by himself. I mean, whenever he has to go out, we go out with him. And Dia doesn't really do much, if anything. He sleeps pretty much all day long now.
but he is in the fenced in yard 99% of the time.
And
Perfect.
we're all,
So I'll also comment that I'm a big fan of appropriate end of life care for both people and dogs. So that
Yeah.
seems like an appropriate thing to do. So I guess I would move that we approve the rabies exemption in this case.
Seconded.
Okay,
Oh,
any other
thank-
comments? Daryl, I.
Matt Beavers, aye.
Lisa, I.
Rebecca Honeywell, I.
Matt Vitale, aye. All right, guys, you have a good night. Thanks for joining us tonight. and I
Oh,
hope
thank
that
you
Gunnar
so
has a
much.
good day.
all right, thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you. Enjoy Gunnar.
Thank you.
Daryl, would it be okay for us to pivot to the kind of COVID review in the time before our 7:30?
Yes. I'll
Um,
pull
I-
up the slides.
Perfect. So if we can magnify, I'm going to make the assumption that people will like a magnified because they look little to me. That's perfect. So we'll just go through and then kind of talk briefly about the plans for the district and then the recommendation or discussion for municipal buildings. So this first slide is tracking our wastewater data, not our wastewater data, MWRA wastewater data, which continues to show a decline. And the important part of this is that it's not affected by variations in testing patterns. It really is the true load. The Omicron surge sort of broke the y-axis, so it's hard to really gauge how close we are to where we were in, say, June, but I think we can certainly say substantially reduced. If you can go to the next slide, Daryl. And then this is just the New York Times visualization, which they update daily, which continues to show a decline in case rates as well as a reduction in hospitalizations, ICU stays, and deaths. We also see an associated decline in the volume of tests, which I suspect as we continue to see increased antigen testing availability, we'll continue to see that decline as these are all reporting PCR-based testing or molecular testing. Go ahead to the next slide. This is our local disease rate as combined with Dover that we provide for the district. And our February 10th data was a disease rate of 32.9, which is sort of the highest we've been this school year, but much improved from where we were at the peak of Omicron and really showing that same substantial reduction. And if you can go to the next slide.
Okay, I'd just like to point out that at the end of August is when we looked at the masking for the schools because this was considered high at that
Yep.
time. So I just, for point of reference,
Yeah,
wanted to
I
note that.
I think a great point, and we'll see that again, I think in some subsequent data, which breaks out Sherborn specifically. So this slide is just illustrating that with the rapid changes that we've seen with this surge, the 2-week averaging can kind of skew the data compared to 7-day averaging. So the line in kind of orange or red is what it would look like if we used a 7-day average, and the line is blue is our 14-day average, which is what we've typically used, which just shows the peak was higher and the kind of time of peak was narrower than we see with the 2-week data. As we get to more stable case rates, that difference will tend to go down. Just because the difference 1 week to the next, the difference in the difference will be less. And if we can go down. For this, we see that our per capita testing rate, which is again, these are the molecular tests, is now back down from the peak that we saw right after the Christmas holidays. and is really lower than we've seen since about August. I think we will continue to see this go down because, again, it doesn't reflect the patterns of antigen testing. So I think that we can't conclude, we certainly know we have at least this much testing, but there's likely also more antigen testing that's happening now that was not happening as commonly in August. So I think that as we see this decline, it doesn't necessarily mean inadequate testing access, which is a conclusion we might have drawn at another time, as we have much more available antigen tests at this point. We can go to the next one. And then this is the test positivity rate, which in general, we like to see below 5%. It was 4.5% for the last data point. I suspect will be lower yet this week. Again, those numbers, as you pointed out, Daryl, are much higher than we've had at any other point, but continue to trend downward. This too will likely skew as people have more access to first pass antigen testing. So I think we'll end up more likely to see PCR used in confirmatory fashion for some individuals. And so, we may see this go up even with lots of testing access because, again, we're not measuring or reporting out the antigen-based tests. But I think the general theme is also we're running pretty similarly to like communities around us. We can go down to the next one. And this is our combined cumulative case count over the period from May 20th to the current date. And you see that sort of steep rise in that period from around Christmas until around January 20th, and really saw a substantial change there. We're now entering a more steady plateau phase, it appears. We can go down to the next one. This is the daily case rate as reported by the state, which doesn't perfectly align with how we have a calculated rate. I think the state has granular individual level data that we don't have in the data we report out. So in the red line here, we see that for that period, Sherborn was 11.4 on the 10th. Dover was significantly higher, which is partly why we had a combined case rate that was in the 30s, while Sherborn was still a little bit lower than that. And we'll see some variation depending on the week and reporting period. So seeing the sustained would certainly be helpful, but at the very least, it's encouraging. We can go to the next one, Daryl. And then this was a question that came up when we reviewed the data at the last meeting, which is kind of demographically, how does this vary? This is not local level data. This is the state reported data looking by age ranges, which you then have to kind of normalize for percent of population because there are more people in the 50 to 59 age group, for example, than the 5 to 9 age group. And so this is a sort of normalized case rate to total population. And we continue to see higher cases in younger people, which is likely an effect of both primary vaccination and boosters, and may also be an effect of social behaviors. And we tend to see the lower rates in older adults. We can go to the next one. So this is data that has been shared previously. The state column is something that's a little bit different than how the state reports it, but I think is also helpful context for the choices we make locally. So if you look at the state reported data, that's that link there for source, they report out two different pieces of information. In slide 11, what they describe is the total number of people who have gotten vaccinated or not gotten vaccinated and the total calculated population size. And then on slide 12, they say of the people who are vaccinated, what percent have been boosted? But if you have moderate boosting in a population that is lightly vaccinated, that can have an overall pretty low prevalence of boosting. And so for the state calculation, I did the denominator is the number of individuals calculated within the age range from the first slide that was for the total vaccination rate. And the numerator is number of individuals who have received a booster. And so what we see is that at the state level, there's significant differences between age groups. So, 5 to 11 isn't eligible for boosting yet. And so that's 0% everywhere. But in the 75 plus for the state, that's 64%. For Sherborn, that's 87%. And as we look at school age kids, it's also pretty different, where we've had about 48% in the calculated rate of boosting for the 12 to 15, where the state's at 17%. So we see that the amount of difference is a little bit more modest as you get older. But in that sort of 12 to 15 and 16 to 19, you see a really different rate of boosting locally as compared to the state level. Although again, I would love to see this number higher. as a reminder for folks, with Omicron, what we saw is that primary vaccination tended to wane in effectiveness for identified cases. It was still pretty effective for hospitalizations and death. And it is not totally clear how much the data for 5 to 11 will translate in sort of in those observations. But I see Lisa's hand up, so let me pause there for a second.
So I noticed that the boosting really has plateaued. And it seemed like when, the Omicron surge was hitting, people were, much more likely to seem to seek out the booster shot. But in the last couple weeks, or 2 weeks, it's really kind of plateaued out. Do we anticipate that because of the declining Omicron rate and the apparent, relative mildness for most impacted people that, do you think it's likely that people are going to continue to get boosted, or do you think that a lot of people are just,
I suspect the people who are going to get boosted have gotten boosted at this point. We definitely saw a period where there was more limited access earlier in the winter. So I think we may see some modest upticks, but I think this is pretty close to sort of what we'll land on, depending on either if there's other external regulatory pieces where they say, fully vaccinated versus being current with vaccines, if that changes access to travel or travel abroad or whatever, I think those things could change it. But my guess is this is pretty close to where we're going to be for right now, because I do think that the Omicron surge and even just sort of access, you clearly see those big differences for the 12 to 15-year-olds in that month. But I don't think we're like, and a month from now we'll be at 96. Like I think we'll be a month from now we'll be at like 49.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
My one comment might be you might see a little bit more uptick in the 12 to 15 just because we saw some lag in primary vaccination in that group as well. There were that was moving a little slower, and so there may become more people eligible for boosting in that group just because they were a little behind everyone else in the primary series.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that.
And then in terms of follow-up from the school, the district's plan at this time is that the state has lifted the mask requirement as of February 28th, regardless of a district's vaccination requirement. So we had qualified for the ability to apply for the exemption by having all 4 schools at 80% above. Each school had then qualified. As of February 28th, all schools will have that. We'll have the ability to have that lifted. In Dover Sherborn, we had a mask mandate that preceded the state's requirement for schools. So the decision the district has made, with which I very much agree, is that the first day after February vacation is probably not the best day to be the first day off of masks. So it will be extending for a week with the first day off of masks on March 7th, with the goal of reducing the risk of having any in-school transmission, recognizing that in general, we've tended to see upticks after vacations and the social behaviors associated with that. And so it will go mask optional as of March 7th. They'll continue to have some escalated on-site testing available to students and staff upon return from school vacation, and continue to have access with state-facilitated antigen testing at home, which the majority of the district has adopted. So I think that we've got a couple of layers, including robust testing access, that will help mitigate the risk. And so, again, I think it gives people understandable pause. My personal opinion is I think it's a reasonable point to be at this point in time. And, I think that we'll see variations in how individual families or students feel comfortable about unmasking. That'll be either their own experience or tailored to the risk of the household that they're part of or the community in which they live. But it sort of, I think, sounds reasonable to me. Matt, I don't know if you have anything else you'd add to that.
No, I think that summarizes it well. I do think we're at sort of a reasonable place. I think that it's a combination of falling rates and what we really saw to be less severe disease. And so I think sort of the case rates, I think just to highlight, a lot of the metrics we're relying on are becoming increasingly unreliable. And it's because we're not capturing all the testing. And so it's hard to really understand what the true case rate is. It's hard to understand what the true case positivity rate is. And then furthermore, with sort of a trend towards a more milder easier spread disease. It may be that higher case rates are tolerable because they don't have as big of an impact. I think all of this comes in the context of always reserving the right to pivot, and understanding that if there is a new variant that is causing more severe disease, if we do see sort of patterns of transmission that are suggestive, we may move. I think it's unlikely we'll move back to universal masking, but we may move back to targeted masking if we identify particularly high risk situations. But obviously anything's on the table if things change.
And if I could just add from like the higher education level on, across the nation, having kids in grad school and college, I think it's very parallel to what a lot of the universities are also doing, and treating it at this point with this variant, well qualified, Matt, that it's more like strep and the flu and other things, especially because most of the colleges and universities have a vaccine mandate. So, very, very high percentages of the population, the students and the professors, like 98+% are already vaccinated. And that, coupled with the less severe illness associated with Omicron, I think is we're at a pause place, which is great. But I think you're right. Like, just be mindful of, just because things might be relaxing now doesn't mean in 6 months we might need to go back to, different kinds of protection.
And so I think I think that's a piece for the school. I think the other piece is just as we have gotten a sort of updated DPH guidance saying, essentially that masking is now recommended for folks who are unvaccinated or have an immune system that may not be fully competent or live in a household with folks with those risk factors. Again, I think we sort of imposed the municipal building mask mandate or recommended that earlier when we had a higher disease burden. And as we kind of get to a place where it's being liberalized in other pieces, I would certainly personally be supportive of lifting the municipal building masking requirement at this time as well, based on both the case rates that we're seeing locally, as well as the evolving guidance from DPH, and sort of recognizing that at a community level, our rate of primary vaccination and boosting is substantially above that of the state as a whole. And so I think in light of that, it is a reasonable step, although I would continue to encourage strategies, including remote work or remote meeting when necessary and appropriate for personal risk factors, to be something that the town actively works on with its employees or bargaining units, and continues to kind of support. I think that it's reasonable to kind of move the mask part of the needle.
I think I'm somewhat encouraged by your observations. I presume from the hospital settings that the disease is less severe, and that's certainly what I've seen published as well. But I also find it a bit ironic that in things written about schools, often it would say that the cases that they were seeing, they did not think were resulting from in-school spread, but rather from outside of the schools, which also says that masking is efficient and effective at preventing the spread. So I'm not as excited about removing that, but I understand the pivot idea, and hopefully, again, we keep seesawing. Case rates go down, things are relaxed, case rates go up. And I think that seesawing is exhausting, and having just a simple, steadier approach, sometimes I wonder if that would be a whole lot easier to deal with.
I think great thoughts. I think one comment I would make for the school transmission is the vast majority of those transmissions are household exposures. And so it's not just sort of casual community contact. It's really saying if somebody in your house has COVID, particularly Omicron, the likelihood of you getting it compared to a community-based exposure is really different. And I do think, and I would sort of look to our colleagues on the select board to sort of think about this, is, if we do have high-risk staff, are there ways that we can help mitigate the costs associated with high quality, kind of KN95 type masks, to sort of make those more available for folks who are public facing, but may have personal risk factors that pose additional risk, where that added protection could be helpful. And I see Marion's hand up. And Marion, if you're talking, you're still muted.
Okay, I did it again. Here I am. Um, At the last select board meeting, there was considerable discussion on the venue for town meeting, which is scheduled for April 27th, end of April. And most people, I would say at the meeting, most people on the select board, Jeff, you can correct me if I'm wrong, were in favor of having the town meeting, just like old times, in the high school auditorium. I felt a little conflicted about it because knowing that the composition of the people who go to town meeting is definitely in the older group, and knowing that this is kind of our first foray into a real interior space altogether for a 3 or 4 hour period, I would just like to hear your opinion on it.
So I mean, I would sort of say, I totally have opinions. I'm not sure that I've got directives. And so, for me, I certainly found that, sort of where we had town meeting last year worked, but I also saw lots of people stacked really close together because there was a lot of interest in talking about Laurel Fields. And so, for me, like, it's a great idea, but it also poses its own logistical challenges and challenges around access. So am I enthusiastic about having a collection of 300 to 500 people who skew older in a, sort of in a closed room for several hours? It wouldn't be my favorite thing, but I also think that for the folks who are particularly concerned about it, there's some ability to mitigate their personal risk with things like the N95. So I would sort of defer. I mean, at least my own inclination would be to defer to the sort of governing bodies to figure out what makes sense and sort of how to balance those risks. I don't know that there's one that I would say this is so high risk that one must not do it.
I think that I would recommend that we wear masks if we're going to do it in the old fashioned way.
I'm sure that'll be the case.
I don't think, what I would say is, like, I think we have to be careful about requiring masks, particularly when it's kind of access to voting. And like, we didn't require them last year. And I think that was partly because people needed to be able to have access to voting if they weren't doing it. And I think the same.
It's actually, it's a regulation. We can't inhibit, like once we pick the venue, we can't necessarily, prohibit people from participating. So that's the other.
No, the solution last year was to segregate them in a special section.
Exactly. Which if we don't have that option, I mean, I guess I will just tell you, in the business world that I live in, conferences that are from April on are all in person. And, depending on the venue, typically mass, like a lot of them, you have to show your vaccination card, but masks are not being required. So I'm not saying that I advocate for that. I'm just saying that's like what the country is doing right now.
I'll also add that there really is a lot of sort of, with increased access to higher quality masks, there is sort of more efficacy of what some people are calling one-way masking. So meaning if someone is particularly concerned that they're at high risk, it is becoming increasingly easy to get access to things like a KN95 or a KF94 mask that's really effective. And so I think people have an opportunity to make those decisions for themselves in a way that we couldn't do, even 6 months ago or certainly not a couple of years ago, when everybody was wearing cloth masks because we were sort of preserving that supply. But I think with better availability of those, there's sort of more opportunity for people to make individual decisions.
Good. Well, that's good to hear. Thanks.
So I just want to be sort of mindful of time and that we've got a 7:30. So maybe we can tackle that one and circle back to this topic if time allows before the 8 o'clock, and if not, after.
Yeah, we may not have to. I think you've all weighed in quite well. Do you agree, Jeff? Jeff, you're muted.
I think so. I've been chairing a pharma summit for the last 2 days. It was 100% virtual. So, and we had a couple hundred people there. So you never know for sure, but I'm glad we're doing the caucus on whatever it is, March 5th, I think, at the DPW garage. And so we'll just have to see about town meeting. You have to do the mailings and everything. So I think we have to decide in late March what the venue will be. We can't wait to decide to May.
That's right.
So I mean, I think the discussion was quite good.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Good luck.
So, and maybe we'll come back to it because I'm still concerned about people who would rather be precautionary, and it's putting a burden on them. So that's because that's who I hear from, right? People who are concerned, who want the Board of Health to step in and be more precautionary. So that's,
I think at the same time, I agree masks are 100% are very effective. There's no question they're very effective, but I think we also can't mandate them everywhere for forever. And so at some point it is going to come down to an individual choice. And I think this is a moment where we can do that.
right. But then I read that a lot of scientists don't think that it's at the endemic stage yet.
So why,
And
I don't want,
this is the
I-
Maybe
rush.
we should probably continue this
Yes.
later.
yeah, I think this is an important discussion and don't want to give it short shift. So maybe we can just do the 7:30 and then find the time to keep talking, because I don't want it to be cut short.
So it's, we have a variance hearing scheduled for septic replacement at 30 North Main Street. And Ellen, did we get all the green cards?
Yes, we have everything we need, yeah.
Okay, and I saw that Dan McIntyre is here.
Yes.
So Dan, I'll just bring up the plan.
And Darryl, just when you go through the plan, you may have abutters or people that are in attendance to maybe want to ask a question when you're ready for that.
Okay. Yeah, so normally what we do is the engineer will present information about the property and why variances are being sought. The board may ask questions, the health agent may ask questions or make comments. And then if we haven't covered any questions you might have, either abutters or just other attendees, just raise your hand and we'll take your questions. Okay, Dan.
All right, thank you. Dan McIntyre representing the homeowner, Steve Constantine, whom I believe is on the call as well. So tonight we're talking about 30 North Main Street, which is a 12,000 square foot lot plus or minus. Yep. So the 12,000 square foot lot is over on the left-hand side. It's pretty much a square lot, about 117 by 110, right in there. It has a 3-bedroom house on it now that was constructed in the 1700s. And I understand it has some historical significance to the town of Sherborn. It's currently served by a cesspool and an overflow cesspool. And there's also a well on site that's right in the vicinity of those cesspools. In addition, there's 2 abutting wells, one up at the top of the page at 3234 North Main, and at the bottom of the page at 28 North Main, that are within 100 feet of those cesspools. And just to pile on a little bit more, the lot is within the zone 1 of 2 public wells, the Heritage right across the street and the C&L Frosty. Their zone 1s encroach onto this lot. So septic systems aren't allowed in zone 1. So this is a kind of a textbook case for putting in a tight tank. But before we can propose a tight tank, we need to exhaust all the other options under DEP's maximum feasible compliance doctrine. So we need to ask ourselves, is there sewer available? Is there a septic system abutting the property that we could share? Is there a abutting property where we could build a new septic system? And typically the answer to those questions is always no. But in this case, it's fairly unique that we do have a abutting property that has excess land, and what makes it even more beneficial is that both of these lots are under the control of the same person. So
Dan, when you say both lots, do you mean 30 and then 32, 34 are all the same owner?
Well, it's controlled by the same person. Steve Constantine owns 32,
Oh, Dan, you're fading out.
it's controlled by the same person. Steve owns 3234 and he lives there. He purchased 30 North Main Street from Elliott Taylor's estate. And he's a controlling party in that, but it's owned by a separate entity. I think there's some sort of a trust that bought it that Steve controls.
And then what is the property that easement goes on? Is that part of the 3234 Main Street property?
Yes, the 3234 property is a pretty unique shape. You can see it goes down and then goes right behind 30 North Main Street.
And is
And
it gonna remain in ownership by Mr. Constantine, or is it going to be developed at 30 North Main and sold to a different entity?
Right now, it's going to remain owned by Steve Constantine. Yes. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. I'm sure at some point every
Yeah, 'cause
property changes hands.
I can tell you that's like my big problem right there. I'm exceedingly concerned about having an easement for a private house septic on a distinct property, because as soon as that changes hands, if that fails, it's a huge problem. And that is not a traditional sort of easement. Easements are often for like public utilities and things of that nature, where there's going to be a large entity that's going to be responsible. But as soon as you're talking about a private septic system being located on a different property, that could be owned by a different entity, like, to me, I just can't even get over that. That's very, very concerning to me.
Okay.
Right off the bat.
I mean, I think there's also concern for setting precedent here too, right? For us, in that it's so atypical that I think it would be odd. I think for me, if there was a way to actually do a property transfer between the lots, I could be more open to that.
Yeah, or change like the lot line, like change.
Yeah. I mean,
lot
you're
line.
effectively selling part of your lot to yourself, but I think just so that the deed is adjusted.
Yeah, but I mean,
I would
it's
feel more comfortable with that.
right. And again, I'm not as worried about right now when there's a common ownership. I'm worried about what happens in 5 years or 10 years, because as soon as that septic fails or there's any problem, it's on someone else's property. It's impacting potentially their well and their property. And it's just setting, up, I think, for a very difficult and untenable situation. So, I guess, is there any opportunity to just change the lot lines and maybe, treat this as like a compound or a single property versus distinct ownership? Or is that, what's the status of that?
Well, we'd really like to do it as an easement.
Yeah.
And that is allowed by Title V.
So what I would say, Dan, just to kind of get to 3 out of 5 people saying, the easement makes me really leery, and it's hard for me to see how I get to yes with that for all the concerns that sort of Lisa and Matt raised. Again, recognizing that right now it's under a consistent owner, but again, we're talking about a 300-year-old house. Like, owners change, and we see lots of properties, particularly in downtown, that are pretty challenging to adequately support with septic system with wells. And so it's clear that Mr. Constantine is making a substantial improvement in every scenario that's proposed. But for me, the idea that, your soil system is on somebody else's property is just too problematic to proceed with, at least for my state of mind, with kind of how I'm thinking about it right now. So
it's on someone else's property, but it's on an easement that benefits.
Yeah, I know, but
an
an easement doesn't free, like, what are the issues, like I said, of failure? Let's go into worst case scenario here, Dan. let's say that fails. Someone else owns that property now. Steve doesn't own it anymore. Okay.
Mhm.
It's sold to a different family. They have a marsh of poop going onto their deck and impacting potentially their well. And it's just, that's where I'm exceedingly concerned. So like, I guess I'm just like now reading down on Claire's.
But if that worst case happened on a contiguous lot, what would you do? You'd replace it. And that's what the easement is for, is to allow
But if
the
it's a
owner of 30
contiguous,
to go on that property and replace the septic system.
but if it's a single facility with a single owner, then there is no, then there, if it's a compound, let's say with one owner, then the owner is consistently on the hook. There's clarity. And, I would look at it more like, okay, if you're a tenant in a house and your agreement is that the landlord's going to take care of, any kind of infrastructure needs, then, if there's a problem, you're calling the landlord. So if you had a condoized sort of concept with a single owner, it's always going to be on the owner that they're going to need to rectify any issues. Whereas if it's just an easement, it gets much grayer. And I mean, I've just seen it really blow up in similar types of circumstances. This is a private septic system for a private home. This isn't like NSTAR having an easement for, an NSTAR maintained utility. So there's so many encumbrances and repercussions that I can see trickling down the road that it makes me very uncomfortable.
And I saw that Steve Constantine had his hand up before, but now I'm not seeing him.
I did. I was just going to bring up, I know people are talking about what I plan on doing with the property. So the plan is to have my son move in. I've got a son and daughter-in-law and grandchild that live in Watertown. My son grew up in Dover Sherborn schools. He'd like to come back to the town. He also has back where the septic's going to be. He's got a small orchard and a pretty good sized garden planted there, and he comes out every weekend. And the plan is for him to move in. So he would move in with his family. And I agree, you can't really tell what's going to happen in the future, but the initial plan is for me to keep this property. He would move in, pay me rent. You're right, he might move out, but I don't plan on selling the property. And I've also talked to realtors and folks like that, and they think that if I were to ever sell the property, it would make more sense to sell the two together as a package, given that it is downtown and someone might, who knows, in the future want to develop it for business or something. But I don't plan on separating out the properties and selling them off. I just wanted to say that.
So could you entertain maybe obviating the current lot lines and divisions and doing more like, as Claire suggests at the end?
Well, or even just moving the lot line and saying, that's now property owned by 30.
Yeah.
Like independent of condoizing or sort of putting them in common ownership, to just say, instead of that having an easement, is it feasible to have a property transfer so that is
right,
owned by 30 and goes with 30 into perpetuity.
Right, you could change the lot lines and almost make like a diagonal line, Steve, from that like corner where that jog is, like south of the barn. Like, is that a possibility? It's just to change sort of where the lot lines are. And
if we subdivide it, then we get into Claire Golden's issues. We can't take more land from 32, 34 and make it non-compliant with respect to nitrogen loading.
But then you could address that with a nitrogen reduction system, right, Dan?
I don't think we can. I think a subdivision of a property that's complying now and making it non-complying is a no-starter with DEP.
Okay, so
okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Dan,
but what
I
we
believe
are
in some document-
proposing is that there is sufficient land on 3234 where we can create an easement for number 30 and still keep at least 40,000 square feet of land for 3234, which keeps it compliant for a 4-bedroom system.
So why can't you just transfer that property? Like it can be the same easement line and preserve the 40,000.
And I'd like to suggest possibly do an easement the other way around. Transfer the property, but keep the easement for access to the orchard or to whatever other gardens are back there.
I mean, I would say for me, like, I can't get there an easement because every other property that would then said, you gave this property an easement, why can't I have an easement? Really uncouples a lot of things that I'm not comfortable uncoupling. Well, and it's hard to say that because I think Mr. Constantine is making substantial improvements, but I just, at least for me, I can't get there on easement.
Yeah, and what's a future system for 3234 North Main? So is that being contemplated as well, Dan? Like that there would be.
We wanted to make sure that before we proposed any type of system to benefit number 30, that we could get in a Title V compliant system on 3234. So we did soil testing with Mark out there, and we showed that rectangular box as a future septic system when Steve ever has to upgrade his existing system.
The other argument against the easement is right here. If you're addressing, and again, I agree with everyone else, this is a huge improvement overall over having cesspools that are so close to wells. So it's a big step in the right direction. But the minute an easement goes in and a new 3-bedroom system is placed there, there's a problem with 3234. And this is from DEP. It is not permitted.
Well, that was this past summer when we didn't have the complete survey, property survey of both lots done. And Claire was right. If we did it at that time, we would have gone out of non-compliance with 3234 because we would have been below 40,000 square feet.
Okay,
But the survey
finding
came
the
back to show that,
48,000.
yeah, the survey came back to show that we can provide an easement to 30 of 8,500 square feet and still leave us 40,000 square feet left for 3234, which keeps us in compliance.
And so Dan, I feel like part of what I'm missing is how does that 8,500 square feet permit an easement but not allow for a property transfer? Because it seems like you're moving the same volume of land.
It could. There's absolutely no reason it couldn't, except that it's the owner's preference that he would like to do it as an easement.
Totally get that. But if you, like you sort of earlier said, I can't get there with the nitrogen loading. So again, I'm not proposing a triangle, but again, totally, like Mr. Constantine absolutely could have a preference and certainly should advocate for it. But from a technical standpoint, the 8,500 square feet as an easement or a property transfer has no bearing on the nitrogen. There's no difference between those two, assuming it's the same square footage from a nitrogen loading standpoint. Do I have that right?
I didn't quite follow that.
So the nature of the assignment of the land, and let's call it 8,500 square feet. And if that's an easement, that's 8,500 square feet. If it's a property transfer on the same lines, it's 8,500 square feet. The fact that those two things are different for the purposes of how DEP measures nitrogen loading should have no bearing. Is that correct?
Right, that 8,500 square feet, whether it's a property transfer or an easement, we can't credit that toward 3234.
Right.
That would be dedicated to number 30.
So in this case, it seems like, again, recognizing Mr. Constantine has the preference from a nitrogen loading standpoint or from a Claire standpoint, there's nothing that prevents the property transfer for being the mechanism as opposed to the easement. That difference is really driven by the applicant's preference. Do I understand that right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
So if this was another situation where Steve didn't own both properties. And we were negotiating with a different owner of 3234. And that person said, yeah, I'm glad to help my neighbor and give him an easement for a septic system, but I don't want to transfer the land.
I don't know that I get there. Maybe that I'd then say, that I think you need a tight tank, because again,
Really?
Me too.
Yeah, I sort of feel the same.
Yeah, and I think Dan, like you hit the nail on the head. That's what I'm worried about. Like our decisions are never just like, oh, this seems great now. Like I understand everything you're saying and I get it. It's what happens in 5 years or what happens in 10 years, et cetera. That's what we always have to be mindful of. And we also are setting precedent, like we said earlier. So I think we have a lot of, we're doing a lot of juggling with this. And I think it would be much cleaner if there could just be a straight up land transfer of somehow that could just obviate the concerns we're expressing with having an easement on a different property for a private septic.
So if I can ask, just to be clear, if I were to give part of 3234 to 30 North Main, would it make sense to go right along where that easement line is and kind of carve that out and say that that's now part of 30?
I mean, that would be
the easiest way.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, that's what we'd have to do, Steve, because we can't take more than 8,500 square feet from your lot, from 3234.
Okay.
So it would have to be kind of that unique shape, same shape as the easement.
Right, and I noticed that you had a question about setback from an easement line versus a property line, and that would be an opportunity for a variance request.
And just if I can, just so the board knows, it would allow a 3-bedroom to have 20,000 square feet, which still would be out of compliance unless it puts in a nitrogen reduction system. And this would be 30 North Main Street. So that'll be part of the other discussion, that if we do look at this, we have to remember there's a 3-bedroom house at 30 North Main Street on a 20,000 square foot lot, if indeed it's receives the 8,200 square feet. So that also has to be addressed.
Yes, and I found some reference in Mass DEP regs, Mark, and I don't know if it was updated from the time of the document I found, although it's still posted right on the main website, that for pre-existing homes on a non-conforming property, that is the nitrogen reduction mandatory? And I think it's an excellent idea, but I'm just questioning that.
No, it's not mandatory. If we were proposing new construction or additional bedrooms, then absolutely would be required to put in nitrogen reducing technology. But for repairs where we're not increasing bedroom count, it's at the discretion of the local Board of Health.
Right.
And DEP has provided a policy document to give you some guidance on that.
Right,
Yeah.
I did see it. It just seemed quite old, so I didn't know if it had been updated, and I couldn't find the update. So,
According to Claire, well, the DEP, on talking with her, if we do consider one way or the other, we're setting a precedent for any other future property with an existing house. So
yes,
unfortunately, the decisions made tonight will set precedent in our town. And she said to me to be very aware of that, because what happens tonight with this property is actually you're setting a precedent. So again, it's for discussion, but I just wanted to bring that up.
right, and it's also, we're in an area where one of the public water supplies across the road from here is in the high 9s for nitrogen, total nitrogen. So it's coming right up to the 10 standard.
Which one is
So
that? Because
it
we
is an
couldn't
important
find
issue.
that.
Excuse me?
Which one is that? Because all our numbers show it below 5.
No, oh, I forget what is it Sherborn Crossing, where the pharmacy is?
I can show the, if I can I share my screen?
I can stop sharing and then you can, yes, hold on.
Okay, can folks see that?
It's not showing, yep.
Okay, so what I did is I went out to the Energy Environmental Affairs Data Portal, which has historical data for water sampling that's done in for different public wells. And I looked at surrounding property, or at least property that was close by. So the first one I looked at was the heritage. And again, that goes back pretty far. It goes back to 1993. You can see kind of after 1997, it doesn't go above 5. And you can see the trend. That's an Excel trend line. The trend is downward. Sherborn Plaza, which is where the CNL is, that's kind of the same thing. That's even lower. So here's the 5 mark. And again, you can see the trend line going down. Mary Star, same thing, trend line going down. Sherborn Crossing, which was just brought up, you've got a few spikes that took place 2017, 2018. It looks like that's starting to settle down a little bit. And again, the trend line's going down there. I'm not sure where this is, the Fisk property, 12 North Main Street, but that also shows the trend line going down as well. And again, anyone can pull the data from the portal if they have an interest.
I'm frankly more worried about the whole easement issue than, the direct. I mean, obviously we need to be mindful of the nitrogen impacts, especially in other people's properties, and well setbacks in addition. But it's really, I think the easement on a separate parcel for a private septic is really the sort of most concerning aspect of this proposition for me.
And this is Ellen. Can I just want to correct one thing. 11 Sherborn Plaza is not where CNL Frosty is. Sherborn Plaza is at 11 South Main Street, where that arts food establishment is now. CNL Frosty is Anamosha Realty as far as public water supplies.
Okay.
And I will say that I haven't looked at the data in a couple of years, but it was quite high there.
But with respect to going back to the DEP guidance policy on this, I think we check off all the boxes for a replacement system. We're moving out of a zone 1. We're actually getting it out of the zone 2 of those 2 public wells. They don't have elevated nitrogen, and we're improving the setbacks of the on-site well and the 2 neighbors' wells to a degree where we're actually meeting the Sherborn's more restrictive well setbacks than Title V. So I see it as a big improvement, whether it's on an easement or private property. It's with respect to nitrogen, this is a big improvement.
Mm-hmm. So the board will have to think about it. I believe we've had some other replacement systems. I'd have to look at a map that use reduction technologies in their replacements in this general vicinity.
And Daryl, I just see Carol's hand up. I've got a comment, but I'm happy if Carol goes first if you're good with your piece.
Yep, go ahead, Carol.
I am attending partly because I knew that this was coming up, and I don't know if some of you remember that I was on Historical Commission for many, many years. I noticed Peggy Novak, who's currently co-chair of that commission, is also on the Zoom. And I did want to just mention that 30 North Main is an antique house. It's part of our National Register district. it's one of the few houses in the center of town that is almost unchanged. I mean, it's really pristine historically from the exterior. I was personally very pleased to know that it was purchased by someone who, you know, cares about the historic district, I think. And so I'm really not familiar with the details of the well issues and the nitrate loading and stuff. And I know it's a complicated situation. And I really just wanted to comment how important it is to do what we can to preserve this as a really important part of our town history and the look and feel of our historic village.
Thanks, Carol. And I would say I'm even more enthusiastic that Steve is replacing the vintage cesspools. To Dan's point, I think there are some parts for us to move forward, and these upgrades I think shouldn't affect the aesthetic or the structure of the house, whether the nitrogen system is part of it or not. I just want to make sure to kind of Mark's earlier point in terms of understanding the piece about precedent. The scenario in which that precedent would be operational would be if we had an existing home on a lot that was sort of less than that kind of 1 acre cutoff. Am I thinking about the kind of right general universe? Maybe that's not perfect, but something along those lines. Because it's like the number of bedrooms per 1,000 square.
Yes, it's a bedroom per 10,000 square feet, essentially.
And so it's really like where one would tend to run into this is lots that are 30,000 square feet or smaller would tend to be where this would be an issue as it relates to a question of precedent around nitrogen loading and replacement systems.
And located in a zone 1 of 2 public wells. And the only other option is the tight tank. So
yeah,
if that's the precedent you're setting, I think that's a good precedent to set.
And so, Dan, can you just kind of walk through if you were to consider a nitrogen reducing system for this system, how would that change the square footage, or would it be a difference in design but a similar footprint?
The leaching field would stay the same. We would replace the septic tank with most likely a fast nitrogen reduction system, which is essentially a mini treatment system, aeration system in the septic tank to really activate the bacteria and treat the effluent better. So under the DEP approvals of these nitrogen reducing technologies, they're required to reduce the septic tank effluent down to 19 milligrams per liter. So still the bulk of the nitrogen reduction is going to happen at the leach field in the unsaturated soil above the groundwater table. And we're already seeing that even the cesspool does that based on our well testing. So that the nitrogen reducing technology in this particular case doesn't add any real benefits, but it does add, last one I did was, it would add another about $8,000 to the cost of the septic system.
If I can just add a point to that, though, the soils out here are beautiful, beautiful, permeable soils. They're sand. It's all sand out there. So treatment in a sand system isn't as good as it would be if you had a till soil. With that said, too, the previous cesspool was used by one person for many years. This house has the capacity to have 6 people living in there. So there are some benefits to being aware of the nitrogen loading that could occur, not benefits, but to be aware of that, the fact that you could have more people living in there, so the nitrogen loading would go up based just on that alone. And the treatment would be less with the sands and gravels.
But we are maintaining the 5-foot offset required by Sherborn in Title V. And if we look at the even bigger picture, which is the kind of the whole watershed picture, what abuts this property is essentially open space, all the town fields right next door. So there's no development there. And kind of the biggest thing for nitrogen is dilution. So we don't have septic systems on I don't know how many abutting acres that are ball fields.
May
And
I
then I
make a
see,
comment?
perfect, fire away,
My
Rebecca.
hand's been raised for a while.
Go ahead.
I think that the whole reason this is coming before the Board of Health is because paying attention to nitrogen loading is where it's a public health concern. I really don't think we should underestimate the importance of protecting that nitrogen loading. You know, none of us have statutory protection on our wells, and if these properties are sold later, you know, somebody might not even could have, you know, chemotherapy or be immune suppressed and have, or be pregnant and have methemoglobinemia and, you know, could have a heart attack and not even know that their septic system is, you know, has too much nitrogen. I mean, their drinking water has elevated nitrates because of the septic system. So I think we really need to pay attention to this. Obviously, I know everybody recognizes that, but I'm more interested in protecting the nitrogen loading condition.
I think that's a great point. I think for me, you know, one of the points that Dan raised is existing well looks like it's about 8 feet from the cesspool. And so, you know, this is sort of coming in not as a de novo construction, but really to say, like, how do we mitigate this? So it sounds like from the board side, there's consensus. I don't want to put words in people's mouth, but I haven't heard anybody who said, I feel really good about the easement. So it sounds like pretty uniformly, folks would like to see that, again, if it's the same property footprint, at least for me personally, that works. But I'd like to see it as a property transfer of that 8,500 square feet. For the nitrogen load, at least for myself, I sort of have two reactions. We know that this is an area that has higher density than the rest of town. And we know that that has impacts on the nitrogen load. And I think Mark's point about the patterns of use, if we're looking to the historical performance, is valid. At the same time, I think that Steve is one of many property owners downtown. And it really sounds like from the state standpoint, we could approve it if we'd like to. If we think that we really want to see the nitrogen mitigation in a replacement system, that's also within our purview. And so it really becomes a question of, you know, if one feels strongly about that, then that is a precedent to set. If one doesn't feel strongly about that, then it's not. I think my own inclination is, you know, I'd like to see us reduce the nitrogen, and it would be difficult to say, boy, it's, you know, it's not important. At the same time, I imagine that the number of properties within the confines of Sherborn that the precedent would apply to, given the small lot size, is probably less than a dozen or 2 dozen. And so, you know, again, finding that balance is tricky. So at least for the nitrogen, I find myself enthusiastic at the idea, but somewhat ambivalent about the process. I would love just a gut check from others.
I was thinking the same thing, given that the numbers have gone down, which is surprising because they were going up for decades. I'd like to look at it a little bit more, the data, because that is a change in a longer term trend. I'd say for the last 20 years, it's been on the rise. So does this mean that the septics that have been replaced in downtown, have the results are starting to show? I don't know exactly.
One would hope. Yeah.
Yes, it could be a very good sign. And right, there are some certainly positives of where this system is located relative to others. And nitrogen reduction systems basically only address nitrogen. So they're not addressing some of the other things that might be in wastewater. So they're not a panacea for all contaminants, but nitrogen is an important one. And I'm wondering whether, so if the board is not inclined to accept an easement for the system, but would consider whatever variances might be necessary if just the easement space that's defined here becomes a property transfer and variances are needed from property line setbacks, would we be inclined to grant that? And if so, I believe that's going to require a new plan being submitted, and do we research something in between now and the next review on the nitrogen issue?
I guess I'm probably more inclined to, obviously I need to understand more about what the issues that come up about the easement, because it does seem like to be much more less dangerous with its location. If you're looking at drinking water quality and public health. So I guess I need to understand more some of these issues. So I think it'd be great if we have a chance to do more research and look into some other options. I don't feel comfortable just giving variances when we know the nitrogen is going to be very high and dangerous. But even if there are other examples of this, it doesn't matter because the water's not potable and they're going to be, renters and possibly new homeowners down the road without options. And right now we have options.
Can I just correct that? The water is potable. It's well below, the state standard for nitrogen is 10 milligrams per liter. We've got testing that's under 3. The DEP uses 5 as a planning guideline for
no, I know it's
Title 5. So
I
I just don't want the record to say that the water is not potable.
Yeah.
No. I'm just saying right now is the time to find the best option because the owner of both properties is the same person. They might be more willing to do a property transfer or something that would give the best possible outcome. That's what I'm saying.
I think
it's good.
With respect to easement versus,
yeah,
I think we got the message loud and clear on that from the board.
And I think that I think the kind of point Daryl's making, Rebecca, is it wouldn't behoove Mr. Constantine to transfer the property if he's going to come back for property line setbacks and we're like, oh, no, we're not going to give you the variance for the property line, because then he would have transferred the property. It wouldn't do any good. So I think the question that Daryl was sort of putting out was agnostic to the nitrogen question, which remains outstanding from a property line standpoint, recognizing that we have to see plans in the final things as a sort of which way is the wind blowing. For me, that would pass the gut check. Daryl, it sounds like that's true for you as well. Matt and Lisa, sort of where are you?
Yeah, I think if that easement line changes into the property line, I would be inclined to support a variance for the property line setback there.
I think I would as well. And as we said, this would clearly be an improvement over the cesspools.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I think the direction that this is heading is all positive and good. It's the specifics of the mechanism for how we get there and how we allocate this. And it's really the easement issue that I'm just not comfortable with.
And so it sort of sounds like what we'd then be giving kind of Mr. Constantine and Dan is kind of marching orders on the property line and plan revision and an ongoing discussion about the nitrogen reduction. Does that kind of make sense, Rebecca?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Perfect. And Steve, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Daryl's concern about the nitrogen loading and looking into that. So one of the things I did as part of this exercise is I talked to the DPW because most of the folks that know water know that playing fields take up a lot of fertilizer, a lot of nitrogen. And I think what happened here, or at least I know what happened, I should say, is the DPW changed their vendor for taking care of that field. And they're now going with a company called Simply Safer Lawn Care. And looking at the history of what was applied, there were no fertilizer applications for 2017, 2018, 2019. 2020, there was one winter fertilization. And for 2021, there was no fertilizations. Prior to that, it looks like it was done almost every year. So I think that's a big factor in that trend line that we saw. That was where nitrogen was being reduced in the downtown area, or at least in the buildings that are around this house.
Okay, that's interesting because back when I was on the Groundwater Protection Committee, every year they'd ask us to review the fertilizing schedule, and we'd always say, get the nitrogen out. And I don't know that they did that because they were locked into particular vendors. So it's good to hear that that has, well, maybe in the absence of any fertilization, but
and Daryl, I can send
sounds
you
like a good change.
if you'd like.
I think, Steve, if you have anything to send our way, I'd certainly love to see the Excel that you shared, both for kind of Ellen in the minutes, but also if you've done legwork, I'd love to piggyback off of it. And then if there's any other information, I think that would certainly be welcome. I guess for Dan and Steve, do you sort of feel like you've got the next steps in the process in a way?
Yeah, I think so. If we could continue this, we can provide that nitrogen information, those trend lines to the board to review. And then we can update the plan to show it as a property transfer.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much.
Okay, so I guess we'll continue the hearing because we're only going to be talking about some of the things all over again. I don't know that I don't think we should be doing it piecemeal this
Darrow,
evening.
do you want to, I didn't mean to interrupt, but do you want to continue the hearing to a certain date, just so it's noted on tonight's meeting?
Yes.
You have to do that or he'd have to re-notify abutters.
And would you like to be on at the next meeting? Would that give you enough time, Dan and Steve?
Yeah, that's plenty of time. Yep.
That's March
Okay.
2nd.
Yes, and Ellen will check the schedule to see what time we can give you.
He can be on at 7:30.
Okay. Does that sound all right?
That was March 2nd?
March 2nd at
Okay.
7:30.
Well, it looks like they're going to continue it. They never got to the issues that you wrote, but what's interesting is
Paul, you're off mute.
they're going to be required. They can't give away
Paul?
more than
Paul?
500 square feet.
Yeah, I'll
Otherwise, they
mute him.
make 3234
Find
non-compliant.
him.
But
Paul, can you hear
they
me?
have
Paul, this
lawsuits
is
that
Mark.
they-
Paul. Yes.
Thank you, Darryl.
Just muted him. Sorry, I was slow.
Thanks, Jeff. So we're continuing till
Hello?
7:30 on March 2nd.
And
Hi.
to Paul's point, there were some comments from an abutter, and we can address those formally as well for the record.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Dan.
Okay. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, back to the agenda. All right. So we're a bit behind. We now have a number of discussions regarding Lot 3 Farm Road, Lot 4 Farm Road, and 53 Farm Road. So Mark, do you want to update us on where we are with Lot 3 and Lot 4?
Yes, on lot 3 and 4, they're under review. And the review has indicated that there will be a deficiency letter being sent to the owner and to the engineer. I spoke with the engineer today and I told him one of the major highlights that I see, and that way he could, and he's here tonight at our meeting, is that the distance from the proposed wells, both on lot 3 and 4, are less than 50 feet from what they are calling a common drive, but when I look at our well regulations, I see it as a right of way. So, I mean, the board could look at that tonight or discuss it at another time. There are other concerns with the plans, but the concerns on those, I think, can all be rectified. Again, that's up to the engineer to rectify those issues, but I do want him to label, like the pipe at Farm Road is not labeled. He needs to do that. And I did mention to Desheng Wang, who's here, that he also wants to make sure he recognizes there's a review from Scott Horsley, and that those items may be discussed tonight or, are up for discussion. I'll leave it at that. It's up to the board on how you want to handle it tonight.
So my inclination would be if we sort of have areas of sort of concern that we'd want to have resolved before being able to vote on a final plan after the deficiencies are corrected. I think it's sort of worth making sure that we do our best to raise those tonight. So in light of that, I would support having, kind of Mr. Horsley provide whatever public comments he'd like to, as well as for any of the butters that sort of may have public comments. Because when we get to do the plan, I'd like to review it once and to have kind of all the key issues raised by that point in time, so that we don't sort of have to go back and say, well, we need to clarify this or that, and we're sort of on a timeline. Does that sound reasonable to other members of the board?
Yes, particularly because in the resolution of whatever the deficiencies are, other things may change. And so any review we do tonight could could vary by the next time we look at it. So I'm not sure what issues we could tackle, since a
Okay.
lot has to do with setbacks and relationships among all the different features.
I agree with Daryl, Matt. I also think it does make sense to perhaps vet and discuss the comments received to date, just so that the next plan can be mindful and anticipatory of, addressing those issues as warranted.
Perfect. And I see Rebecca's hand up. Is your hand up for this, Rebecca? Are you,
No,
is this like,
I need to
perfect?
take it down. Sorry.
Perfect. And Mr. Murphy, I see your hand up. I'd like to finish the discussion within the board first, and then we'll recognize you. I had a couple other points I was hoping to clarify, Mark, and I don't know if you've got any further insights to offer, but one was the sort of citing of the SAS for 64, which is listed on one of the plans, and just sort of how it's listed as an approximate location, but given the sort of proximity to well setbacks, we'd just love to understand whether we know how that was arrived at. And if you're able to answer that, great. And if not, I'd sort of love to hear from Deshang about how that location was established.
Sure, and I would defer that to Deshang to see why it says approximate, not actual location.
Matt, which property were you referring to?
64 Farm Road, 64 Farm Road.
Let me just look at the plans now. I can't remember if it's, I assume it's lot 4, because I think that's a more southerly lot. But let me just double check and confirm.
Lot 3 is the more set. Oh, you're right, lot 4.
So for me, I see it on page 2 of lot 4 of the 3-A lot 4 at 65 Farm Road, new septic, new well plan. I see the approximate SAS listed in that one. And so that's the one I'm hoping to clarify on that plan, if that helps you bring it up. Exactly. And Deshang, are you able to offer any insight on that?
Deshang, you may be muted.
I see you, but I don't hear you. Can you just raise your hand if you've got a mic issue? Oh, perfect. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
You sound beautiful.
Okay. Yeah. So those wells are the record we obtained from the town, and so I guess we didn't do a in-ground survey, so that's why we labeled as approximate. So I think if the town's record is accurate, it should be accurate. So that's just a wording concern.
So just to make sure I'm clear, so you pulled the record for 64 Farm, located the location of the SAS, and that's what's
Right.
reflected on the plan? Okay.
Right.
Thanks,
Yes.
Deshang.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other kind of comments to the board before I acknowledge Mr. Murphy? Perfect. Go ahead, Mr. Murphy.
The reason that I raised my hand was on one of the issues that Mark flagged. I thought it would be helpful to at least frame it so that everybody knows what the issue was, and that was on the distance of the well, which I think he's looking at section 6.0 of section 2. I don't know whether or not it's possible. Daryl seems to be very good at bringing different things up, but if she can bring up 6.0, I can at least identify for the board members what it is that Mark has raised and at least frame for the board the issue. I think it's section 2 of the regulations.
Yeah, I just have to find the page.
6.0. I think you might be in the section.
Regulation.
Regulation 2.
Mark, can you give me a keyword that would
Yeah, I can give you the
page 20. Page 20.
Oh, thank you.
Oh,
That's
all right. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. 6D, 6.0D of reg.
And then just scroll down to the bottom of this page.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think the issue that Mark had raised with Deshang on this is that the first sentence of section D says wells shall be located no less than 55 feet from the edge of the traveled way or 50 feet from the edge of the right of way, whichever is greater. To my mind, and every time that I have read that sentence and the way I believe it has been applied, is that this reference to the edge of the traveled way or the edge of the right of way means the street. And so, for example, a street has two components potentially. One is the traveled way where there's actually pavement. And the second is the legal right of way, which can be wider than the traveled way. And so this sentence was designed and always implemented to be a reference to either that traveled way where the actual pavement exists or the legal right of way that the town has to place its road, whichever one of those is greater. And then the second sentence is the one that is applicable in this situation, which is that wells shall be located no less than 20 feet from a driveway. And I think you see in sub 1 on the next page, which says, when protected in a manner approved by the Board of Health, that well may be located no closer than 5 feet from a driveway. So in this circumstance of these two lots 3 and 4, there is a common driveway. And the measurements that were made for that common driveway in the plan submitted used the setback in the second sentence of D, which is wells shall be located no less than 20 feet from a driveway. And you'll remember probably in one of the earlier lots for 53 Farm Road, there was the benefit of D1 taken by the applicant, and they moved the separation distance from that driveway, which was also a common driveway, to be less than 5 feet, no closer than 5 feet from a driveway. I believe they made it at 8 feet. So from our standpoint, if in fact this is brought back at a subsequent hearing, that's the teed up issue as it relates to that part of the anticipated deficiency letter that Mark will be writing about that subject matter. And if in fact there is any other property in Sherborn in which the distance has been measured from a common driveway at something other than the 20 feet setback, we would very much appreciate if that could be identified to us, which we doubt. But because, as I said, the common way that this is understood is that there is a right of way of every street that cars travel on, in which there is a paved traveled way, and then there is the right of way that can have some portion of it that doesn't necessarily have pavement in it. And that's the standard for those situations, which is different from the situation from a driveway.
Daryl, can I just ask you to scroll up just as we're sort of defining, because I think actually early on this page, we have section 2.7, which includes the language. Perfect. So we've got right of way, 2.6, where it's defined, it looks like in 2 ways, a strip of land within which is built a public road, which appears to be Mr. Murphy's kind of interpretation. But then there's a second clause that sort of describes a path or route that may be lawfully used. So I certainly see that you're most comfortable with the first clause, but I don't know that we can, as a board, ignore the second clause. And so, that certainly sounds like it'll be a topic for future discussion.
But see, with traveled way, what we're saying is we meet both. We are the 50 and 55 that I think you're right that these refer to, the 2.6 and the 2.7, those referring to the 50 and the 55. Those don't relate at all to the common driveway, neither the 2.6 definition or the 2.7 definition.
So is your assertion, I mean, it seems like this is a path or route that may lawfully be used. Certainly the common driveway, as you described it, would fall within that definition to serve the distal properties kind of further within the parcel. So again, I recognize we sort of see it differently, but I think it's important for the record to reflect that this is the definition with which we're tasked to implement. And so again, I don't know that it's for us to adjudicate tonight, but certainly I think is probably an important point of discussion.
Can I ask a question? So if you were to have a driveway serving multiple residences, which is a private way, is that automatically a development and HOA? Because, you know, when I'm looking at the Massachusetts definitions of things like, you know, private ways, it's serving multiple properties. They say private ways may be private, but open to the public. So I guess I'm just sort of confused, like, so are we acknowledging that this is indeed a development with an HOA because it's a shared driveway, or, you know, how are we slicing this?
So
Okay, so just a couple of things.
Jim,
First of all,
Jim, I'd like you to,
Jim, please let.
oh, I'm sorry. I
Matt
thought
speak.
Lisa was asking me a question. I'm sorry.
No, it would go through the board anyway.
I've got a follow-up, and I think that is that in looking at the zoning bylaws, we've got section 4.3.9, which lists, and Daryl, I suspect you don't have those up. I'll read them in a minute.
No, I don't have that. If you want to share.
Perfect. I am happy to share my screen for that effect. And so Jim, that way, hopefully you can sort of tackle it once. But again, I think the goal for tonight is to identify the key issues, not to adjudicate. Do you guys see it right now with the zoning bylaws at the top?
Yes.
Yep.
And so here we see common driveways serving more than 2 building lots shall require a special permit from the planning board. Minimum requirements that they must be constructed in compliance with the Sherborn driveway bylaw, and sort of have a variety of conditions and exemptions. Within the open space subdivision bylaw, there's also a section 4.5.3, which states that if the proposed open space subdivision involves a special permit for one or more common driveways or any other use that requires a special permit, the proceedings for all such special permits and the site plan review for lot configuration shall occur in one consolidated special permit proceeding before the planning board. And I'll note that on the A&R lot received, I think as part of the discussion about the lot 53 sizing, it includes a plan that appears to delineate a third house on that common driveway, which would appear to signal that those special permits would be triggered. And so would kind of like to understand that sequencing as well. So I think those are the great driveway questions, Jim. And if there's no other comment from the board, I'll sort of pass it back to you.
Okay, so I do agree that if in fact there is a common driveway that serves more than 2 driveways, then the planning board requires a special permit. But that's just separate and distinct from the way in which the setbacks to driveways and common driveways have always been used. And it's not necessary to have a quote unquote HOA. I guess if in fact we need to, we'll look at some other properties in which we know that there are common driveway that service multiple homes in which the setbacks are not based upon 50 or 55, whichever is greater, but are instead based upon 20, and that you can get even less than 20, but no less than 5 under the BOH regulations. And then separately, the other question that was asked related to, it's not that common in Sherborn, but in other circumstances, there is something different between a public way and a private way in a subdivision. So for example, and I don't know the history of this, but I'll just use it as an example. So say, for example, when Cider Hill would have been developed, initially Cider Hill Road, until such time as it would have been accepted by the town of Sherborn, would have been a private road. In that situation, that private road, which would not have been a common driveway, it would have been a private road in which there would have been driveways off of that private road. In that circumstance, that private road would be treated the same as Farm Road, which is a public road. So that's the only distinction. Hopefully that answers or gives some context to what I think was one of Lisa's questions.
Much appreciated, Jim. Daryl, I'm going to just share my screen again. And I think, Jim, I think this came from you guys. Do you guys see, do you see this A&R plan? And this was as it related to I think the 53 lot size, if I recall correctly, which sounds like that issue was resolved with the building inspector. And so in looking at this plan, it appears that we see sort of building 1, building 2, and building 3. And previously, as the applicant has approached the planning board as part of the open space subdivision process to kind of have those discussions. And so it would sort of seem that we're at the place where there should be a special permit. Again, whether for satisfying the conditions of a special permit, it appears that it's been established that there will be at least 3 buildings served by the common driveway. And based on the discussion with an open space subdivision, it certainly seems likely that there'll be an open space subdivision. So it seems like that this has triggered those associated bylaws. And since it's materially relevant to the placement of the wells, that, you know, for me, I guess it gets tricky to say that's an outstanding issue, but we'll talk about it later when it appears that there should be a public hearing to resolve that and to permit that. So,
okay, well, I just wanted to clear up something that the client, you know, after a lot of discussion, has ceased its exploration of an open space subdivision, and it's not pursuing that. What the client wants to do is to construct 5 single-family homes on these 5 new single-family homes on these 15 acres that happen to be in the 1 acre zone. If, as and when it believes it needs a permission to have a common driveway to serve a 3rd lot, it does recognize that it has an obligation to seek a special permit from the planning board. Based upon information that we have surveyed and reviewed in the town, the planning board has been usually very receptive to it, because they recognize that the benefit of a common driveway is a reduction of impervious area, which is to the benefit of the environment. So when we get to that place, when we have a 3rd unit to be served by that common driveway, we will seek such a permit, but it doesn't really change the setbacks. I would point out again that that was not the way in which we analyzed 53 Farm Road's driveway, which was a common driveway that served 53 and the existing house on 55.
and for this one, again, I want to clarify, because you sort of are saying the applicant, you know, may do a 3rd building, but I'm looking at the A&R plan from December 21st, which appears to show a 3rd building. Help me understand how that's not a 3rd building.
Until and unless we can get all the things that we need to get done for it, it's not a 3rd building. We would have to get a septic plan approved. We would have to get a well approved. It is anticipated that we will do those things, but they aren't there yet.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mr. Murphy. If you're good, I'll then go to Marion, but I want to make sure I'm not cutting you off.
Okay, so the only thing that I wanted to communicate initially on the things that were brought up by Mark related to that first issue of deficiency that he mentioned. I do have some other comments about other things, and so long as you'll come back to me, I'm happy to yield the floor.
Perfect. Appreciate that. Marion, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just have a quick comment. I just thought I should comment, you know, having come recently off the planning board, that the definition that Jim described of a street, a right of way, the traveled way or whatever, really applies both to public roads and to private roads. And both of those are different from driveways. And so, I mean, so far, everything that Jim has said rings true to me. It seems to fit exactly what the planning board understanding would be. That's all I wanted to say.
I appreciate that, Marion. I think one comment I would make is, you know, again, for us, I think we have to kind of go to, I certainly recognize that the planning board has that approach, and I don't mean to dismiss that, but I also think a sort of reasonable abutter could say, you know, I see 2.6. how does that not apply? And so I think that we also have to be consistent with our own definitions, and that certainly may be a place that we need to seek some additional guidance.
So I think,
oh, go ahead, Matt.
sorry, my internet's been in and out, so hopefully you can all hear me. I think one comment I'll make is that I think one thing I wonder is that if the applicant does in fact add a third building and has to apply for a special permit for a common driveway, then I think if they're issued a permit for a common driveway, we're going to be stuck calling it a common driveway. Does that make sense? I think it's hard to both define it as a permitted common driveway and as a road. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, and I think that, again, the right-of-way definition, at least as it exists in 2.6, I think doesn't speak to road or not road. I think there's sort of two. And again, I think that reconciling those differences is probably one of the to-dos to help resolve that issue as the deficiencies get corrected and the plan can be considered. Other comments from the board? Otherwise, I'll sort of swing back to Jim. Hearing none, go ahead, Jim.
Okay, so the only other thing that I understood that Mark said, one was it sounded like a very technical thing about a pipe marking at Farm Road, which I'm sure that's something that DeShang can deal with offline and doesn't need to be brought up to a higher discussion point so that we can each have that issue framed. And then I understood that the other thing that he said is that there was a review from Mr. Horsley that may be discussed. I think I have a brief question about that. One, I am aware of the fact that Mr. Horsley was hired and has been hired in the past by the town of Sherborn to act as one of its consultants. I'm not sure whether or not any of those contracts still are in effect. And I wondered whether or not Mr. Horsley had obtained from the town a waiver of any conflict that may exist from his participation in this proceeding. And so, similarly, I'd wanted to know whether or not Mr. Horsley was representing also his firm, because I know his firm was also initially provided a proposal to the applicant. And I wanted to know whether or not he'd obtained a waiver from the applicant concerning any potential conflict of interest that may exist because of that representation or solicitation, exchange of proposals at the time of initial interview before Mr. Wang was hired.
Let's try this off mute. So Jim, it sounds like you've completed your questions. And then DeShang, I saw your hand up. Do you have additional questions or concerns you'd like to address?
Yeah, I'm not an attorney, just from engineer as a roadway and driveway perspective, and hopefully will just to help to enhance understanding and discussion. So from my design career, any roadways, either private or public, is a way that will provide frontage to an individual house lot, and the driveways doesn't. So that's my perspective to differentiate driveways and roadways. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, DeShang. And Jim, I just want to confirm your hand's still up. Do you have additional comments, or would you be able to?
I think I am not as good at this.
No worries. I know we had an issue before.
Okay, sorry about that.
Perfect.
No, I have asked my question about Mr. Horsley's conflict issues, and so long as I have that answer, that would be sufficient. Then at least I thought that was what was probably going to happen, was that the board was going to consider some presentation by Mr. Horsley, and we may have some comments or opportunity to comment after we hear that.
I think that sounds fine. So perfect. So your hand's down. And again, I would say, I think that Mr. Horsley is certainly welcome to comment, as would kind of any abutters or other pieces. I think my big goal for the output for tonight is to identify as many issues or concerns that we have so that we can achieve resolution and kind of continue to move forward with the review process as it stands. And so, you know, if there are things that you think are substantial concerns as it relates to the project, I think tonight's a good night to raise them so that they can be followed up and pursued as the deficiencies get corrected, and can kind of inform the final vote when we get to that point. So, Mr. Horsley, you're certainly welcome to begin, but if other folks have comments or things that they'd like us to have on our radar as we consider this going down the road, that would be great.
Thank you, Brian. Did you want to speak first? I see your hand up.
I will leave it up to the chair to determine where my comments should fit in. Scott and I have talked about this, and I wanted to present some opening comments before he spoke, if that was okay, but it's certainly up to the chair.
I think I'm pitch hitting for Daryl on this, given my deep enthusiasm for my own voice. So Brian, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Okay, thank you very much. And let me get my hand lowered now. Uh-oh, that wasn't good. Good evening, my name is Brian Moore. I live at 49 Farm Road. I live right next door to 5565 Farm. I have some opening comments, and Scott Horsley, who we've hired as our expert, is going to, I think, present some results. And I have a few quick closing comments. I've tried to make it as brief as possible in the interest of getting through it. I just want to get through it in an undisturbed fashion here. First of all, I want to reiterate and restate on the record that Mary and I are not opposed to development in Sherborn, as long as the regulations allow such development. Example being following the rules and following those regulations of the state and the town bylaws. We are pleased to hear Mr. Murchison, the developer, state that during your October 20th board meeting, a few quotes from the record include Mr. Murchison saying, "I've demanded over the years that all the rules that the town and of the state be followed in development in town." A second quote from the same evening was, "I've been on both sides, right? I'm a developer. I'm also a neighbor, and I've demanded that all the rules be followed. And I have no problem with all of you demanding that I follow all the rules." And the third quote from the same evening is, "I will follow all the rules. These are not actually complicated projects, and I am following all of the rules, and I will." So against this backdrop, I wanted to quickly point out a few issues about 53 Farm Road, which is what I asked to be heard on. These are equally relevant for lots 3 and 4 is being proposed now for your consideration, but might not actually get tabled tonight. So segmentation and sequencing. We're pleased to hear that the applicant is making offers to not exploit the open space development portion of the subdivision bylaw. Last time we heard that at a public meeting, we asked for that to be presented in writing. And of course, we all kind of chuckled at it because we want it in writing, but still, if that's really the applicant's intent, I think that would go a long way towards appeasing some of the concerns about the quantity of septics and the density of the septics that are being proposed for right next door. So we would like that to be in writing if at all possible. I'm going to skip over these parts because these are all examples of how the applicant was planning to put in up to 10 houses, 10 dwellings on the 16 acres next door, essentially co-locating all those septics right on our property line. But if he's saying that he is backing out of that concept, then I'm going to reserve these comments for some other time. I still think that if he, even without those 5 lots out back, I think he still would trip the EHIR requirements for total seepage in a project. And by segmenting the permitting process through phasing these individual permits, he's actually kind of evading the site-specific evaluations that are mandated in section 3.1 of the Board of Health regulations for an EHIR. So even with the removal of that, we still think that's applicable. We stated several times that the 5565 Farm Road parcels are connected from the hydrogeological standpoint. And we've now done a lot more research, which you'll hear about from Mr. Horsley, about how that is so. We provided aerial images which depict the seasonal expansions and contractions of the pond at 65 Farm Road, an area map that's mapped with Mass GIS, Mass DEP as a vernal pool. And the pond has expanded well beyond the mapped wetlands that were demarcated with the Conservation Commission more than 5 times the last 20 years. And if you translate this into what people understand FEMA flood terminology, I believe that represents the equivalent of living within a 25-year flood zone area. A location where there's basically a 1 in 4 chance of a reoccurring flood every single year. It's more probable than, you know, rolling any given number on a die if you were to just roll it on the table. It's staggering to us that this wasn't even considered or discussed in any of the applicants' paperwork with the Conservation Commission. The pond portions of the 16 acres long Farm Road are also a mapped hydrogeologic connection that's on file with USGS in their stream stat survey. I can tell from living here for more than 15 years now that the entire front portion of 55 and 65 Farm Road serves as the source of groundwater, which feeds the very wetlands that are situated on 55 Farm Road and those further west and north along the shared property line immediately up gradient of our drinking water well. These wetlands and surface waters are a simple expression of the underlying groundwater through this hydrogeologic connection. Throughout this area, the water flows into, out of, and through the ground, ultimately combining with the natural springs which exist in our yard to form the headwaters of Sewell Brook. I can tell you from living here for 15 years also that the drought conditions of 2021 were unparalleled in both their severity and their impact. This was a period when the applicant was performing a significant amount of their test pit work. The spring in our backyard, for the first time since we moved here, dried up during 2021. It is the only time in 15 years of living here, and I think ever, that spring went completely dry. Since things have started to turn back towards more normal conditions, we recently observed tremendous drainage through the front portions of the 55 Farm Road parcel. This drainage was readily visible from the street, and we took the liberty of providing video footage to the board and to the applicant as well for their consideration tonight. I can attest that by the end of Saturday, the day I took the video, there was at least what appeared to be about a foot of standing water on the eastern side of the 55 Farm Road shared driveway. There's also evidence of other open surface drainage at 55 Farm Road parcel, including a paved drainage swale which directs the stormwater runoff from the driveway directly into the resource area on the western side of the shared driveway, or the western side of that shared driveway, which is depicted on the applicant's own maps and plans. And we feel at some further point that might garner attention and consideration as well. So thank you for listening to my opening remarks tonight. And I look forward to having just a few extra comments when Mr. Horsley's done with his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Scott, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, if I may, I'll share my screen. I've just got 5 or 6 slides. It'll take no more than about 6 or 7 minutes, if that's okay with the board.
Sounds great.
Thank you. And let me just go to full screen here. I won't walk you through this slide because I did provide more detail on this in my letter. I've met several of you before, but I think it's appropriate first time before appearing for all of you to explain who I am. And I do have a fair amount of experience in the field of water resources. As it says here, I've worked mostly domestically, but certainly some international work. Most of my career and currently still in place is ongoing work with U.S. Environmental Protection Agency headquarters and many of the regional offices as well. I have and continue to serve on a number of advisory boards, specifically with Mass DEP here in Massachusetts, but on some national boards as well. I serve as adjunct faculty at both Harvard and Tufts. And then finally, I have been qualified as an expert witness on the field of hydrology in both federal and state courts. So I'll just leave it at that. Certainly, if people have questions on my qualifications, I'm more than happy to answer those later. So I only have a couple of comments that I'll highlight that were in my letter. And the first one deals with this setback from a open surface drain. So obviously, this is a copy of a section of your Board of Health regulations, section 10.2. And I've highlighted, I think, the relevant part that I wanted to address here, which is a 125-foot setback from, and I'll just highlight here, two features, an open surface drain or a water course. And I did attend the last Board of Health meeting, and I heard some discussion of this, and I'm aware that the town has sought some input on the latter term, the water course, and whether or not there are wetland resource areas. And I'm asserting in my comment letter here in my review of the project that this feature on the front of the site, and I'll show a map in a second, is not necessarily a water course or a wetland, but it is certainly an open surface drain. And I'll just mention, I do a lot of work in the stormwater field. There are two stormwater systems as they're identified by EPA and Mass DEP. There are open surface water drainage systems, stormwater drainage systems, and there are closed. Closed refer to those systems that have catch basins and subsurface piping. Open stormwater drainage systems, which are also regulated, are just as they sound. They're open to the surface. They transmit and convey stormwater from one point to another, which I believe this system clearly meets the definition of an open surface drain. I also just want to show the map, and Brian referred to this. This is some mapping by the U.S. Geological Survey, the so-called Stream Stats program, that is a heavily relied upon method of identifying hydrologic connections. It's used with the Massachusetts wetland regulations. And I do note, by the way, the highlight here, the colored dot, is actually, I believe, Brian's property at 49 Farm Road. So the subject parcel is just to the east of that. You can see the pond that is on many of the plans. And what this suggests is there appears to be, according to this level of information, a hydrologic connection that runs westerly towards that wetland system that is on Mr. Moore's property. This is the prior site plan. I believe it's dated 2021. I don't have the legend on here, but this is the plan that does show, in fact, this so-called swale. And I'll just use my cursor. I'm sure you've seen this and are aware of this. It appears to flow from one stormwater drainage structure here. There's identified as a 10-inch drain pipe, stormwater drain pipe, into an open surface channel, an open surface drain. And it connects to another culvert here that passes beneath the driveway, and then continues on downstream into the wetland, again, associated with Mr. Moore's property. So this was identified in the prior site plan that was submitted to the Board of Health. However, on the more recent site plans that I believe are dated in 2022, that swale was deleted from the plans, or I should just say it does not appear in the plans. I'll leave it at that. So I've included it here just with the approximate location, the blue highlighted line at the bottom, which again I can point to with my cursor. And I'm measuring from this lot 3, a distance of approximately 60 feet from the leaching field to the open surface drain. I've also plotted on the plan the 125-foot setback. So you can see in this case, the entire proposed leaching system was within and does not meet the minimum setback. And by the way, this is under a section called minimum setbacks. Could be larger, could be required to be larger if conditions warrant, but certainly at a minimum, the regulations require 125 feet. And here's lot 4, same scenario. I've identified again, the swale is no longer on the plan, although I believe it still exists. And this is the leach field for lot number 4. This one measures a little more than 100 feet, but certainly does not meet the requirement of 125 feet. I also mentioned in my letter that based upon elevations, I looked at the estimated seasonal high groundwater elevations for both of these systems relative to the elevation of the open surface drain as it discharges or leaves the property, and the septic systems are hydrologically higher. So there's certainly the ability for the hydrologic connection and discharge of these septic systems into this open surface drain. So I believe there is a credible connection between the features and the basis for why the regulation requires this minimum setback. The second comment I have is regarding this environmental health impact report, section 3.1. The regulation, I won't read the whole thing, but again, I've highlighted what I think are relevant sections. The intent here, I believe, is that for some projects that are higher density or where septic systems are close, closer together, there could be cumulative impacts. I believe that that's the public health purpose here. That's my interpretation of it. 2,000 gallons per day is a cutoff that the state also uses in some of their regulations and guidance, recognizing that if you put 2,000 gallons per day or greater in close proximity, then there may be some special effects related to things like groundwater mounding and water quality impacts. So what this regulation is calling for is for a project, proposed project, more than 10 units or 2,000 gallons per day, that this environmental health impact would be required. I certainly think this project, as it's been identified, I understand that the applicant is attempting to get permits, trying to segment the project into individual projects. It's clear to me from reading the documents submitted to the town that this was a single owner and there were multiple lots as part of one larger project. Nonetheless, one can argue that there are multiple septic systems in very close proximity. And if we keep our eyes on the goal here, I think, and that is to protect public health, there's a legitimate issue here that needs to be assessed. Therefore, the regulation calls for this impact assessment. And if I go on to the next page, the regulation specifically calls out a method to do this assessment. And I might add, this is a methodology that I assisted Mass DEP in developing. And this method is referred to as an area of impact analysis, as indicated here. It is referenced in the Title V regulations. It's also referenced in the guidance document that is referenced here. And this is a figure from that document. And I'll just quickly summarize what Mass DEP is suggesting to be done. So basically, this area of the project represents the source, the wastewater disposal area. And the intent here is to look at groundwater flow directions, as is identified here, and evaluate the area down gradient of the septic system discharge for impacts, and using so-called nitrogen loading rates from septic systems. They also suggest adding loads from fertilizers. I have not done that yet in my preliminary calculations, as well as groundwater recharge, which serves to dilute the wastewater and then calculate a concentration at the down gradient property limits. Now, this figure noted identifies two property limits, one the property itself and then something called credit land. I don't believe the applicant is proposing any credit land, so that part of this assessment here would be not relevant to this project, but certainly the existing property boundary would be, as well as any wells beyond that. And so this is what I've prepared as an initial assessment using this approach. I've taken the estimated seasonal high groundwater elevations, which I've identified here with these in these little boxes with the blue numbers from the various test pits. I've then prepared a water table contour map using that data. This shows a southwesterly groundwater flow direction, which I think is consistent with other people's interpretation. I then, within this yellow area, which I'm representing as the area of impact, I've diluted that septic system effluent with recharge, groundwater recharge, as identified in the DEP methodology. And I've computed concentrations at two locations, one at the down gradient property boundary, which is right here. And that number I'm calculating is about 26 milligrams per liter. I've also calculated it at a further distant area where the applicant has identified a neighboring well. And in that area, my calculations show around 19.9 milligrams per liter. And so I think this warrants, at a minimum, this certainly warrants further looking at this. And again, I think the other thing I should mention, I do mention this in my letter, this base map, as I've identified here, is from the applicant's consultant, Creative Land and Water Engineering. I recognize that the exact, that these dimensions on these leaching fields have been altered somewhat, but in my judgment, my opinion, not enough to change the analysis. The shape of these are slightly different. I did not put those in here because there is not a composite plan. As I said, they've They started with a composite plan, the one you're seeing here, and now they're filing individual plans on separate plans. So I will identify that the exact shape of these systems has been altered somewhat, but the locations have not been altered significantly. Therefore, I think the analysis is still valid. And I will stop there. I believe that's my last slide for now. I'll stop sharing my screen and be happy to answer any questions that the board might have. Thank you.
Perfect. I think I appreciate that, Scott and Brian, your comments. I guess one question I think I have for Jeff and Marion, sort of with the select board hats on, is, can we ask you guys to follow up to identify whether there's any pertinent conflict of interest from the town standpoint as it relates to Mr. Horsley? I don't know that you'll know the answer to that question or the details of that contract, but I'm hoping we can sort of pass that back to the select board to clarify if there's any sort of conflict of interest piece there.
I could certainly mention briefly that I am no longer under contract with the town. It's been a number of years since I've been under contract with the town, so there is no conflict, in my opinion.
Perfect. And Scott, I very much appreciate it, and I still want to put Jeff on the hook to just sort of make sure that we kind of cover our bases in that regard.
Certainly.
That was the sort of only piece for me. Is there other comment from the board or other questions, either for Mr. Moore or for Mr. Horsley?
I do have a couple of.
Brian, I'm just going to ask you to hold on for a second.
I will.
Just
Thank you.
Perfect.
A quick question. So how does the whole issue of the water course or the surface drainage interact or not with the Massachusetts wetlands regulations and or Concom? Scott, if you could elaborate on that a little bit, that would be helpful.
Yes, Lisa, thank you for the question. I think it's a really interesting question. I see this working in many, many towns. These are, as you know, Board of Health regulations. Sometimes they are consistent and conform with other boards' regulations, such as wetland regulations. Sometimes they're not. In this case, I see that portion of the regulation, I'm happy to put it up again if you'd like, does have some references to wetland areas, but I believe that those are relative to the second term in the regulation, water courses. Water course is a term, as you may know, that it is used in state regulations to reference wetlands. But the first term is open surface drainage, which in my view is a separate term. Now, it is possible that an open surface drain could in fact be a wetland. But I believe the way it's identified in the regulation is two separate terms. And as I say in my letter, I don't believe there's any necessity to confirm it as a wetland to call it an open surface drain. So yes, thank you for putting that up there. And let's see. I had it. Okay, so you can't see my pointer, but the third line from the bottom, it says 125 feet. Yes, thank you. 125 feet from any open surface drain or any water course. Those are two separate things. And I did hear the prior discussion, which is why I wanted to identify that. And I think it was appropriate to look into that. But in fact, I'm not sure whether this is a wetland or not. I have not seen it yet. During conditions where one might be able to make that determination, it may be a wetland, but I'm not relying on that, nor does I think the Board of Health have to rely on it being a wetland under 131 or under 310 CMR 10 to call it an open surface drain. And again, my understanding, at least, I'm sorry, I don't want to go on too long here, but I think it's an excellent question, and that gets to the core of this. I think looking at the intent here is that obviously we don't want septic discharges, daylighting, breaking out into areas that can cause public health problems. Surface drains clearly are an area, open surface drains are clearly an area we don't want, let's just call it premature discharge of wastewater. And having a setback to that makes all kinds of sense. So I think there's some, in addition to the wording here, I think there's some legitimate technical basis for it. But I'm sorry if I went on too far, but happy to follow up. So it's a good question.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
All right, so you've pretty much captured some of the things I have been thinking about, Scott, so I don't need to say too much other than I was part of initially looking into How are water courses defined? How did that relate to this part of our regulation? Why was it in here? And also meeting with Claire Golden to go over it. And so from Mass DEP perspective there was a lot of deferring to the Conservation Commission and the kind of work that it does. But you're right that they focus on wetlands, and that is soil types and vegetation type. And so I've spent some time in the last week or so trying to think about what it means to have this open surface drain in here. And we don't know who wrote this portion of our regulations, but we do know that someone who is both on the board and lived in town was one of the participants in writing the Title V regulations. So I can only speculate on some of the things that why this might be here. And one of them was the reason you just mentioned of the whole reason we put septic systems underground is to get them away from people. So they don't, you know, not knowing, like, come in contact with water that appears clean, but is really not. And so could this be a reason that someone included this in here, in which case it's not necessarily tied to a wetland condition. So even though our discussion with DEP, they didn't have any particular concerns about open surface drains when we were talking about it, does beg the question of this is in our regulations for whatever reason it's in there, and that we can't be sure of. And then how do we want to look at this? And maybe, you know, the interpretation of if it wasn't identified by Conservation Commission wasn't our issue, may not be correct. So that would be more for the board to think about and how we adhere, because we do try our best to stick to what our regulations say.
Daryl,
And this one's fairly definitive, but yes, sorry.
Daryl, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. If I may, I think you raised a couple of really good points here. And one thing I forgot to mention is this is a local Board of Health regulation, which, as I think you all know, you clearly have the authority, the enabling law to go beyond Title V. So simply asking what DEP does to enforce their versions of setback from Title V might be helpful, but it certainly doesn't limit the town to go further than that. I mean, there's all kinds of examples and case law and very good court decisions, many of which I've testified as an expert witness, that obviously defend Board of Health, town Board of Health, from going beyond Title V regs. So the comparison as to whether or not this is in Title V, I would say, is fairly irrelevant. And then secondly, on the wetland question, which again you raise, I mean, right, if you ask the Conservation Commission for their opinion, they're gonna make a decision. They're gonna give you advice, I believe, on whether or not it is a jurisdictional wetland under their laws, not necessarily yours. Now this one says wetlands under 131, section 40, that's a state law. But again, my interpretation is I am not asserting that this is a wetland. Also, I want to also be clear that I'm not sure it's not. I haven't seen it yet. I will look at it when I get a chance. But at this point, it's clearly to me, in fact, I can't, what I try to do in these situations is try to figure out how would I prove or suggest that this is not an open surface stormwater drain. Has a culvert at the beginning, has a culvert at the end, it carries stormwater. If this is not an open stormwater surface drain, then I've never seen one, because that's exactly what this is. And I think the important point here is the word "or." I think because my recollection of your last meeting and hearing your discussion was, it was very much focused on the watercourse wetlands part and not the open surface drain. This is what the regulation says. If one wants to comply with it directly, then one must comply with it directly. That's my opinion.
So is the issue just from a public health, Board of Health perspective, Daryl? It sounds to me like the issue is if that setback is not met, is there an enhanced potential? And again, considering climate change and the fact that our water table probably isn't getting any lower, it's only getting higher. We're going to have more flooding events and more, significant rain events, which are going to only increase surface flow in swales and drain, open drains such as this. Is if there can be any even direct contact with septage, setting apart the issue of could there be impacts to potable wells. That's also actually, a public health concern. So I guess,
Yes.
that's something I just hadn't thought about. I had been very focused on the well setbacks previously, but, there's certainly the enhanced potential for dermal contact with septage if, the distance isn't adequate from these surface drains. And again, groundwater is very shallow in these areas. It doesn't take a lot of significant storm events, which are only happening with enhanced frequency, in the world we're living in. So just being realistic here, I just think that's like a distinct public health consideration we should keep in mind.
Lisa, if I
Right,
may,
and I think
may I
it's-
add one thing to what you said, Lisa, briefly.
Scott, I just want to hold
I'm
on
sorry.
because I sort of, from my standpoint, I certainly welcome your input, but
Okay, thank you.
I also think that in general, like it shouldn't be a sort of one-sided discussion. I think Mr. Murphy at the start had said he'd sort of like a chance to opine, and at some point, I think we just need to carve in and either let DeShang opine or kind of find some balance there. Unless others on the board feel differently, I think that's part of the balance I'd like to try to strike. Is certainly appreciate your presentation, Scott, but want to make sure that we sort of continue to have a balanced discussion. Mr. Moore, I know that I said you could go next. I'd like to go to DeShang if that's all right with you, but just want to, okay, perfect. DeShang, go ahead.
Okay, so I think at the focus here, this looks like this surface drain, a ditch, and the possible impact on the septic design from the septic to the downgradient property and wells. So the first, I read Mr. Horsley's comments, and I appreciated his teaching in universities. I have more than 30 years practice as a professional engineer designing septic systems and large septic systems. And I did many big river studies throughout the world. And but on any project, doing the project is not a hydrologist or not whatever scientist or consultant, a lawyer. So it's required a professional engineer following the local and the state environmental code. And I just like to point it out is under the wetlands protection and or under the Title V, you can look at. So drain, you have to have some natural channel, and then you have to have like an annual flow of water flow. Contrary to, as we all know, this summer was the wettest summer probably on record. All right, so, and I don't know if Mr. Horsley have been to the site. Sounds like based on what he said, is he just looking at aerial photos and images and here and there and never puts it on the ground. That's what I heard. I have been to the site numerous times during heavy rains, and including the recent snow melting with the frozen ground, some temporary surface impoundment. I saw that, and on all neighbors' property, pretty much, I saw that too. In the summer, the high groundwater table was almost like, it's not almost, in some places even higher than the spring. So the groundwater table throughout our testing is 7 to like about 20 feet deep. So we cannot just using a one site's data from one person's property have a concern to apply universally to the town or to that area. So groundwater changes point to point, not even property to property. So the design requires specifically in the leaching field how many wells and how we monitor it, how to correct it. We follow the rules and regulations in the town. And I have been doing many. I don't know if Mr. Horsley have done any designs in the town, following the rules and regulations as a professional engineer. So that said, when we were doing the design, so we reviewed the area as upland, like dry as a bone, even in the springtime, but not like in the ground is frozen and you have a quick thaw and the rain on top. That's just a temporary purged temporary condition. As a septic treatment, we all know they are not going to be frozen due to the temperature of the sewage, and they are not going to be traveled on the surface. So if you're looking into the Title V drain, the town, there's no open surface drainage even definition. So I would assuming, based on what I read, it get to be under the state code, unless you revise your bylaw or regulation to be specific and guide design professionals, not just theoretical and speculated impact. So as here, if you're looking on the state code, it's only required 10 feet, okay, setback from surface drain, except to wetlands, which will require 50 feet. So here, from what I see, that little 10-inch pipe, if you go look at it during the review, and both from conservation and the Board of Health, we went there during all very heavy, severe rains. So there's almost no water coming out of there. That pipe is like in 4 or 5 inches deposit with rotten leaves. So you can tell through all the years, if there's significant water even coming out of there, you're not going to expecting that kind of organic deposit. And the same way, we look at the culvert, the 24-inch culvert, which is basically people put there for probably the convenience during the construction. So during the rains, we go there, the same thing, the leaves deposit at the bottom. During all the rainstorms in the July and August 2021, we went there, checked it out. There's no flow. There's no discrete channel. If there's any cause of a water flow or drainage, it get to be a ditch or pipe. So we don't observe that. And the town's consultant agent from the conservation double checked it. So there's no technically flowing water. So the groundwater there is more than 5 feet deep. So the water is not really interfere with, as because of you have a septic system in a higher location, you're speculating that that water will surface discharge to this so-called open waters location. That's just speculation. There's no evidence, no facts. So if we are discussing design things based on speculation and theory, then no, you don't need an engineer. So or you can't. So you cannot do anything. So because theories can go anywhere. So this is just from the water. We complied with it, and during the review and approval of 53 Farm Road. So we determined there's no impact, and because it's just the hydrology evidence, soils, vegetation, just don't show any of that possible impact. And so about all the segmentation, so I think Mr. Horsley quoted the MIPAS regulation. So there's a threshold over there, and for our case, it doesn't apply because we have A&R lot. So it means you entitle your right on a public way. Each lot is just like in any of the neighborhood. They have theirs. If all those houses, A&R lot have to, if allowed to construct it, you will have to use applying the same logic. All the house construction was segmented. So that's unless we are changing the law. And so even for this, if it's a subdivision and lumping them together, the total disturbance criteria EIR under the MIPA is 50 acres, or even just the ENF review is 25 acres. As Mr. Horsley also noticed, the total land is only about 18 acres. There's no way even go close, 5 acres impervious area. So it doesn't have even the basic meet criteria met to even triggering that so-called segmentation. That's just dragging that terms and putting on this project, which is just not appropriate application. So in that terms, and again, for the given all that, so the Title V as well as the town's regulation we follow. So there's no place we see as at this point it will triggering doing all the analysis. When you do a nitrogen or concentration analysis, it's very dangerous just partially taking an incomplete groundwater data and the claim is my data. That's the focus, because that's never meant to be used for that purpose. That all the things we presented there is purely follow the current regulation to design for single family house, A&R, or so whatever. If you need to really to do, you have to map in the groundwater in much more detail. If you're looking at the Mr. Horsley's drawings, so that flow is just imaginary pass going. If you're looking at the value.
Deshang, I'm going to ask you to just pause for a second. I think our goal tonight for both Deshang, Mr. Horsley, other commenters is not to have an exhaustive review, but to make sure that any key issues are raised. So open basin, open drain, clearly a key issue, clearly a point for discussion. And Deshang, you're welcome to continue. I don't want to have an exhaustive review of all the pieces. I think the goal here is to identify the key issues that need to be resolved before approving a final plan. And so I sort of don't want an extended back and forth. I really just want to make sure we're surfacing everything so that you and the applicant and Mr. Murphy have a chance to kind of know that these are the key things that we're thinking and likely talking about, and can come into that sort of transparent and prepared. So with that, Deshang, I interrupted you. I'm happy to let you continue. I just wanted to kind of flag that goal.
Yeah, I almost done, Matt. I really appreciate it. You pointed out. I would agree that we will provide written review and update or revise our plan according to the agent's comments when we received it. We definitely don't want to prematurely to argue anything. I'm just basically respond and state the facts. What is the approval of 53 Farm Road has happened. So it was not just that people didn't looking into all those issues. All the issues raised was discussed, but again, we get to go according to the law. It's not singled out. We have to go much more scrutinized, theoretical, debate. So we are not in that realm for with this board. So, and I'm not going to comment on the right of way at this point, because I believe our council is going to looking into a little bit more. I just provide a very quick understanding from my design why we treat it as a common driveway because we don't really feel that's a right of way. But again, so I understand the board need to consider it and probably need to clarify in your regulation. Otherwise, if the instructions or requirement is vague and not clear, and there's no precedent incident, is a case, it will be very difficult for any engineer to follow. I'm not saying to play the language game, so we have to be clear. So if as I understand from any perspective, engineering or just common language, that part I would suggest the board need to clarify it with our council, because that's a very important design factor. It's not.
Can I please make a comment? I really have to respond.
I think so. What I'd love to do, Deshang, it sounds like you're all wrapped up. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes. I will wait until the written full
perfect
review, and then we will work in technically on that. So there's not really much of things I feel we need to do academic kind of debate or conference. So
perfect. So what I would propose is Rebecca's a member of the board. Will go next, then Brian, and then Mr. Murphy. So Rebecca, fire away.
Thanks. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a hydrologist. I'm not a geologist. but I had not seen this parcel, so I decided to drive by over the weekend and look at it. It did not take training to see the flow of water coming out of that pipe and traversing the entire property. There is no doubt that there was a course of water there. I was completely amazed, and I'm a dermatologist. You know, you do not need to be highly trained to recognize that there's water passing there, and I'm sure this isn't the first time that it's happened. It's just nobody's really paid attention until now. So neither the abutters nor the future residents of this proposed project, whether it be 2, 3, 12, 20, whatever, none of those people are going to have protection of their private drinking water by state or federal law. The drinking water laws do not apply to private water supplies. That means that we have to be very careful to take into consideration why the regulations were written the way they were. It's very clear these are existing regulations that were written for a reason, and I think we need to pay attention to this, because it's not just one abutter who has a potential problem down the road. And I think as a Board of Health, that's our responsibility to pay attention to these issues and make smart decisions. These are existing regulations. We're not even going out of our boundaries.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Mr. Moore, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you very much. Just to reiterate a couple of quotes. I will follow all the rules. I am following all the rules, and I will. Those are Mr. Murchison's own words. The rules in 10.2 say there should be 125-foot setback from any open surface drain. All members of this board have been provided with video and photographic evidence of such a drain existing. It is not the first time that I've seen it, but we documented it because no one else had. And it's our feeling that that setback should be enforced. We'd like to thank the board for their attention tonight. We recognize that the evidence provided here should be sufficient to at least garner further attention of that setback requirement. And I had other concerns about the well and the pumping at 53, as well as the septic that's been approved for 53 already. And I don't want to cause a commotion, but you know, I wanted to just quote one thing from Mass DEP guidelines on private water well installation. The well at 53, which is lot 2, which was previously approved and installed, is a location we feel runs afoul of the Mass DEP guidance. The DEP guidance states, consideration should be given to the direction of groundwater flow and the location of any groundwater discharge to a surface water body, which is essentially what that stream is over there. Where possible, wells should be located up gradient of potential sources of contamination. Wells should not be located between a potential source of contamination and an area where groundwater discharges to the land surface. We feel that that well was placed between the septic up at 55 and where groundwater discharges to the stream, basically fueling the wetlands over here on the property line and serving as the headwaters to Sewell Brook. We feel that that should not have been approved of in the first place. And our final, we really would like the board to consider whether with this new evidence of the surface drain, whether they will move forward and allow, you know, a building permit to be issued for installation of a septic within 125 feet of the open drain, and these other new lots as well. We're concerned about the incessant pumping that took place in order for them to pass their the well purging at 53 Farm Road, which depleted our drinking water supply. Drinking water supply is shared by us and all of our neighbors. And we're concerned that maybe the pumping not only served to deplete that resource, but also might have exacerbated bacterial impact in the groundwater aquifer, where the applicant pumped for something like 4 weeks and probably shocked the well and kept pumping until he got a passing test so that he could sell the lot. In closing, we'd like to thank the board and the volunteers and ask them to keep all these matters in mind in reviewing any and all further applications of any parcel derived from the 5565 Farm Road property, especially the setback and EHIR requirements. I believe that the applicant has the right to speculate about development opportunities and should be allowed to develop his land as required by the law, but the town and the neighborhood should not bear the price when such speculations don't pan out. That's what speculation is. It's a guess. It's a rolling of the dice. Sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. And in light of our current recent recognition on the prevalence and toxicity of emerging contaminants, we as a community, I feel we need to establish better precedent, stronger precedent for, protecting our precarious and value of the natural resources which serve as the source of our drinking water, our surface water, our wetlands, and, our town. As our elected representatives on the board, we're asking that you listen to our concerns and the opinions of our expert and act favorably on our recommendations in your deliberations. And thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks so much. I see Daryl's hand up, and then we'll go Jim and then Josh Salvin. So Daryl, fire away.
Okay. Boy, this might be more in the middle of things. So I have mixed feelings about this drain issue because I agree it's there. Certainly if there was a drain up gradient of a location, then that would be probably not such an issue. So it is a very situational thing, but I do think it is the way it's written at the moment and could probably benefit from some improvement here and some clarifications to what the issues are associated with it. And then I also don't know if this is something that, right, what does it mean when we've made a decision, but we have received some new information about conditions there? Do we go back or do we just go forward? That I think I would ask the board at some point if we want to contact town council to get some guidance on this, because we haven't encountered this before, I don't think. And I don't know, Mark or Ellen, if we've encountered this open surface drain issue in the past. So I just wanted to say that I think there's some gray areas here still.
So I'm going to give myself a little bit of the sort of permission to recognize myself. I think, Daryl, to your point, I think it's certainly worth getting town council guidance for. I think at the same time, there is an appeal process for 53 Farm. That process kind of played out and the permit was granted, and the, sort of the timeframes in those pieces are sort of relevant. And so I don't know that we can sort of say, this is new information and there's sort of another bite at the apple, but I'm also not sure I'm right. I think town council guidance on that, in that regard, would certainly be helpful. So I would second the value of that discussion, although perhaps with a slightly different lens. I don't know that the decisions at 53 have to then translate to 55 if there's a new understanding that's obtained or kind of a different interpretation, but for me, it's hard to go back on 53.
Yes, that's what I meant about, or we just go forward. So.
Yeah, but I do think I would certainly be enthusiastic about town council guidance on that topic to just make sure that we're sort of acting appropriately.
Yeah.
And Daryl, are you good for your comments? Is it okay to go on to Mr. Murphy, or did you have more?
Yes, it is.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
Okay, Mr. Murphy, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I think we've framed as another issue whether or not this is an open surface drain and the implications as it relates to the engineered system. And I think DeShang has pointed out that he has seen the property and observed its physical characteristics, but Mr. Horsley hasn't. So I think that's one of the things that he's also indicated that he'll provide some additional information on that subject in writing after he gets Mark's letter. The second issue that I wanted to talk about was the language of the Environmental Health Impact Report, Section 3.1. And again, I guess I'd ask the indulgence if it's possible to bring up that section onto the screen and walk through the actual language as opposed to just the highlighted sections that were made. So this is, if you're able to, Daryl, 3.1 of Section 3.
Soon, there we go.
There you go. Thank you very much. Okay, so I just want people to read this backwards and forward after I've done it with you once. But you'll see that this particular environmental health impact report deals with 4 possible projects. And the first is the applicant for any proposed project of A, 10 or more dwellings, whether in a subdivision or on an approved roadway. That's the first one. And this is not any, that's not this project. The second one is B, or any commercial or industrial development with a gross floor area exceeding 75,000 square feet or a design sewage flow of 2,000 gallons per day or greater. Those 2,000 gallons per day or greater modify only commercial or industrial development, which this is not. Or
that was not what the board discussed.
I'm sorry, can I please finish? Or C, any planned unit development. Or D, any earth removal project exceeding 350 cubic yards of material per lot or 1,000 cubic yards of material per project. Those are the 4 types of things for which the regulation provides for an environmental health impact report. It does not say the applicant for any proposed project of 10 or more dwelling units, whether in a subdivision or on an approved roadway, or a design flow of 2,000 gallons per day. The 2,000 gallons per day modifies only B, any commercial or industrial development with a gross floor area exceeding 75,000 square feet or a design sewage flow of 2,000 gallons per day. And if in fact you're going to engage town council, we have already sent something to town council saying that they have not applied the 2,000 gallons per day to any residential project unless that project was over 10 or more dwelling units. And so, as I said, when you read this forwards and backwards, the 2,000 gallons per day does not modify 10 or more dwelling units. And I just ask you to sensibly think about it that way. Under the board's regulations, every dwelling unit must be considered to have 3 bedrooms. So that means 10 or more dwelling units would at minimum have 3,300 gallons, and it's not in there as a 2,000 gallons per day. At 2,000 gallons per day and 10 units, under the board's regulations, assuming 110 gallons per day, that would be an average size dwelling unit of less than 2 bedrooms per dwelling unit. So it's clear that the 2,000 gallons per day modifies a commercial or industrial development. And I just ask you all to read that section with your English hat on rather than any particular point of view about whether or not you like or don't like the applicant's proposal. And the third, and the
Jim, would it be okay if I just responded to that piece, or would you prefer I wait till the end?
I'm happy to have you respond now to that.
So what I would say is, one, I think at least examples that had previously been supplied by Mr. Murchison predated this volume in the regulation. And so it was a different volume flow that was actionable at the time of those examples. If there are additional examples I haven't seen in this regulation was circa 2019, if I recall correctly. And I think the second is you certainly are entitled to a different interpretation than the board. But again, I recognize that you're sort of the counsel for the applicant. I think it's incumbent on us as a board to interpret and apply the regulation, some of which, some of us at least were involved in its revision. So it certainly may recognize a difference in our opinions in that regard, but also want to be clear for the record that at least the previously supplied examples all were at a different design flow threshold for this trigger. And again, my apologies to interrupt. I just wanted to address those while that piece was fresh, and I'll sort of pass it back to you as we'll then return to the other commenters.
Okay, I'll try to invite everyone to read it in a less advocate's voice and say, please notice where all the ors are in this sentence. And when you parse it, you will see that there's 4 types of projects, and the 2,000 gallons modifies the second of the 4 and not the first of the 4. And then the last item that I wanted to comment upon is, I think Daryl and Matt already talked about it a little bit, and there is a process for appealing prior permits, and we went through that process and the board decided. And perhaps you're going to go back to town council, but I cannot imagine a situation in which any decision of a board after appeal periods have passed can sua sponte be all of a sudden overturned. And it would be a horrible situation if in fact that's where we found ourselves, that you go through a process, you hear appeals, and then there's a new unwritten regulation change that says, notwithstanding anything we did before, we're going to change our minds. And I just really would urge you, what's done is done, and what has been decided has been decided. And in Daryl's words, I think you have to move forward on that one, and you can't move backwards on that one.
Thanks so much, Jim. I think I saw Josh as the next one up. Then I think Arthur, Scott, Daryl, if your hand's still up, let me know, and I'm happy to recognize you first. And then Bob. Daryl, are you still up or stuck up?
No, my hand could come down, but for the benefit of those other folks listening in on this, I do see the ors as a dividing point in that, and the board did recently revise this and have lengthy discussions about this section, and thus 75,000 square feet, comma, or that would be the beginning of another category.
And I guess
design sewage flow. I just wanted to give another perspective on it, following the English.
But I think, I'm sorry.
My one suggestion is right now we don't have anything that triggers 2,000 gallons in the plans proposed.
Right,
and so I think that an important discussion to continue. But I also think that we need to have concrete information with which to do so.
Yeah, and Matt, I think there was, several different aspects introduced in the discussion we had a few minutes ago. This was maybe one aspect, and I think I agree with what you just said, Matt, but I think there were other things focused on the setback from the water course and the open drain that are a little bit different, because that's information that perhaps was not provided at the time that we were reviewing things initially, that is in the regulations and could have a material, impact on decisions.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I think great points. Josh, I see you up there.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. I won't take much of your time. I know I've spoken before, and I'm not an engineer, and I mean no disrespect to Mr. Horsley or Mr. Wang, and I certainly don't have a great understanding of the law. So I'm speaking more with Dr. Honeywell's point of view. I'm a pediatric cardiologist and not a dermatologist even. So, but what I can tell you from my observations, I lived across the street. I've had the good fortune of living across the street from this property for 9 years, almost 9 years now. And, through several previous owners, what I'll say is that this year was unusual, to echo Brian and Rebecca's points. There's the summer was unusual, I should say, and in the last 9 years, what I've seen with some frequency is that water has come from the pond all the way across to the driveway, meaning so from the driveway eastward and from the driveway westward. I could speak to this because Jane, Elias, the previous owner of the property, had frequently asked myself and my son to use both my lawnmower and her tractor, her subcompact tractor, to mow the areas around the east and west side of that driveway all the way out to the pond, and then excuse my sense of direction, west of the driveway. And many a times that she offered to pay, I won't even tell you, my son a certain amount of money to mow that, which I had to supervise him doing. He wasn't able to do it because the area was essentially underwater and we couldn't do it. And we'd have to make plans to do it the week after, the week after, the week after, when that area dried up. This is standing water that's from the driveway east and west all the way out to the road. And I mean, it precluded us from even being able to do a simple task like mowing the lawn. So again, I'm not an engineer. I don't understand this stuff. I certainly don't understand the legal implications that Mr. Murphy brings up, but I can speak to you from somebody who's lived here across the street from 64, directly across the street. I sit in an office that I look out across the window, what used to be horses and is now torn down trees, and watching water on both sides of this driveway. I just think it's important for the Board of Health to consider that and however they see fit. So I appreciate your time, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Josh. Arthur, I see you up next.
Thank you. I just have a couple points to say. Mostly, I would hope that if there were new information that came to light, regardless of when that came into the process, that would be considered. There's no decision that I think couldn't be undone if in the interest of the current residents and abutters or the future residents of these properties, if it were in their health interest, it would be a travesty not to consider that now and just to let it go and say, well, that was then, but we're going to ignore this new information. But mostly I just wanted to say that, I mean, Brian is eloquent. I won't say anything that he's already said, but I want the board to know and this is probably understood, but just so that it's on the record, that there are many of us who feel the exact same way. We share his concerns and support everything he said. And it's not just Brian, his family, and his property. There are many people, and I'll at least identify myself as one of those people who shares those concerns. And the board should consider that it's not just one family, one property, but that I would say universally all the abutters, but at least to speak for myself. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Arthur. Scott, I see you next, and then Bob.
Yes, and I'll be brief. First of all, I just want to clarify something. I think both Mr. Murphy and Tashang testified that I have not been on site. I have no idea how they might know that or not, but they're both wrong. I have been to the site. I've been on the road looking at this, so I have seen the drainage. So I just want to clarify the record because what they testified was incorrect. And the second point I'd make is I see the commas. I read it the way I read it before. To me, I'm trying to keep my eyes on the big picture here, public health. And the intent is, as I said, 2,000 gallon per day number is in some DEP guidance and regulations. The presumption is that around that level is when you start having more impacts than a single family home, typical single home. The fact that these three systems are right next to each other, again, regardless of where the commas appear, I think it's worth looking at the cumulative impacts of that. That's my point. We can fix the commas, but I still think the impacts are there, and I would urge that should be considered as part of this proceeding. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott. Bob, go ahead.
I'm actually all set, Matt. Thank you.
Perfect. So it sounds like we've sort of elucidated the kind of comments and commentary, with the key issues being the open surface drain question, the right-of-way question as it relates in particular to section 2.6 of the Board of Health regulations. And then, depending on the results of the open drain follow-up, those pieces. I would say for me, I still would like to understand better, particularly since the right-of-way questions directly communicate with the common driveway. I would love to understand that a little bit more by the time we reconvene after the deficiencies have been addressed. And so that's another piece that I hope we can sort of have resolved by the time we come back. I feel like I've hit the highlights, but if not, certainly the minutes will reflect them in terms of the kind of key issues for follow-up and discussion as we plan to kind of consider final plans. Does anybody on the board have anything else to raise or anything else to add, or any other community comment?
I would love to make another comment.
Fire
and
away,
I think-
Rebecca.
But I won't if you want to have it. I just want to reiterate that regardless of what our decisions are, you know, in the short term, we have long-term issues that we need to pay attention to, or at least consider, because this is really public health. But it also ends up extending into property values and, you know, a lot of different issues that are important to a lot of people. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that. It's really important. I mean, this is black and white, and it's existing in our regulations. I think we really need to pay attention to what we're seeing.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And just kind of in the interest of time, knowing we still have issues like COVID and masks to address, I'd love to kind of close out the discussion for the farm road parcels that we discussed. We'll then have the follow-up that was described for Mark and DeShang. It sounds like we'll have those communicated in writing, and we'll expect kind of, it sounds like DeShang will send us something as well to consider, which I think will be really helpful. Do we want to just kind of close out the COVID discussion and then can go to the others? I'm also happy to do the agent's business and then circle back to COVID. Cheerfully flexible.
No, I would like to go to agent's business. There are people waiting, and
Sounds
I
good.
need to take care of that.
Thank you,
Sounds
Madam
great.
Chair. There are people, I believe, still in the audience. I would ask if we could continue on with the agenda. I'm not for sure. I know there's a designer in the audience who represents both of the items that I have under agent's business. And I believe the developer is here for item number 2. So we have 2 people waiting on item number 2 under agent's business.
Okay, so let's take that one first.
Okay, thank you. So 176 Lake Street is coming back to us. It's a revision to a previously approved plan. The plan was renewed for 2 more years, and then the property sold to someone that wanted to redesign the shape of the house and put the driveway on the opposite side of the house. So the new septic plan you see in front of you defines the changes being made for the requested changes of the applicant, and they are in compliance. The only thing this plan was not reviewed by me. It was reviewed by a previous agent. The only thing I do see that can occur, and we do this in the normal circumstances, they did not include the H20D box, distribution box, but that can be part of the conditional approval, and I'd recommend approval with that condition.
Okay. First, I'm going to ask if, well, let's see. I'll ask if we have a motion to approve the plan, and then we will have further discussion and take questions, okay, or comments.
So
Okay, no motion,
it doesn't require any variances, right, Mark? I just want to make sure.
That is correct. This is new construction, and there are no waivers.
No
being
variance.
requested.
Okay, great. Thank
Right,
you.
so it'd be a motion to approve conditional to the adjustment to the specs for the box.
Yes, and this is Ellen. I just want to say when that plan was renewed in 2021, it was renewed conditional to the H20D box.
Oh, okay.
Great.
Thank you, Ellen. You've got a better memory than I do. Thank you.
So moved, Daryl.
Okay.
Someone second?
Can you make a full statement rather than saying so moved? I'd really appreciate that.
I had said it just a minute before, but it was
Yeah.
to approve the plans conditional to the D-box adjustment.
And I so moved it.
Just a
You did get
question.
interrupted by Ellen and a couple other comments. And I just wanted to hear what we're voting on.
Just a quick question. I see Bob's hand up.
Yes, no, you can have a motion and then we can have our discussion and then take Bob's comments or questions. And so first,
perfect.
does the board have any questions or comments on this?
I do not.
Okay, so Bob.
Yeah, so I have a question, and that is, it's really to Mark, because I think he's the one that would have taken a look at this. And I'm pretty familiar with this particular regulation. The board has a rule that the basement floor needs to be 2 feet above high groundwater. And this revision includes a lowering of the basement floor by 2 feet from an elevation of 215 to 213. And I would note that the test pit in the house, which is how you determine where groundwater is, the bottom of the test pit is at 213. So I'm not clear how, maybe Mark can clarify this because maybe I'm missing something, but was that test pit adjusted, Mark? And what is the high groundwater? And if the high groundwater is 213, which would be the bottom of the pit, how is it that the basement floor can sit right at that level?
Mark, would you?
And I'm going to refer
Be
this
willing
to
to answer
the designers here, Peter Bemis. Like I said, I didn't have the full review of this plan, but the designer, Peter Bemis, is here. Maybe he can answer that. If not, we can put this on the next agenda.
Yeah, I mean, this changed, Mark. This is a new change for tonight.
Peter, are you here?
I was actually making sure Mark saw me so we could take up the 59 North Main, but I am here. So, and I wasn't necessarily prepared to speak on this topic. If Mr. Murchison's picked up something that we overlooked, I would certainly want to correct it. So I have no problem continuing this to your next meeting.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Address it properly. So
sounds great. Thanks, Peter.
And it's a good point. It does show that the test hole at the house was down to elevation 213. The basement's at 213, so it will have to be re-engineered if you don't dig another deep hole. So I do agree with Bob that that is an item that I did not see, and it does need to be rectified.
Perfect. So Peter, you'll follow that up and we'll plan to have this on the March 2nd agenda.
yes, and if we have to dig a test pit, if Mark would be available, great. And if not, then I would have to probably continue again, I guess, until he was available, because that's probably the best way to solve it. I don't believe there's a groundwater problem at this location. It would just be a matter of digging another test pit. So thank you.
You would need to apply for that test pit, Peter.
I fully understand, sir.
And we can schedule as soon as possible, but do start that process first, and we'll go from there. Unless you have other data that can indicate groundwater deeper than 200 and the elevation 213. Thank you.
I guess just one question for clarification is if that's a solution we pursue, is March 2nd the right date to have this discussion, or do we need to have a different timeline just for the purposes of?
I wouldn't set a date. It's not a hearing. I would just wait until the plan's ready for approval.
Perfect. Sounds great. Thanks, Mark. And thanks so much, Peter.
Sure.
Okay, stay around, Peter. All right.
Yeah, if you
So
don't mind,
50
thank you.
Yes, 59 North Main. Mark, do you want to introduce the issue, or I can, either one?
I can go over it a little bit. So we looked at this prior, and it does show 2 additional rooms in the basement of this property, and the house didn't have this design within it at the beginning when it was reviewed way back when it was reviewed by the ZBA. At the same time, we were looking at how many rooms can you have, and the other question was, it is restricted as a 2-bedroom facility under the deed recording, I guess, that was set with the ZBA. In speaking with the state, they said you need DEP, to be specific. Claire Golden. She said you need to be reasonable when you're looking at these type of approaches. And one of the issues could be is that when do you have too many rooms? And it's up to the applicant, she said, too, to indicate how it could not be used possibly as a bedroom. So that was her comments. And, you know, with that said, the board could look at the potential for a deed recording to the Board of Health, not to the ZBA or to the planning board. So she gave a couple options, but no real true directive. So that's what we discussed over the past week. And the board has discussed this at prior meetings, that is it overuse of the room count in respect to it being only a 2-bedroom unit. And she also mentioned that usually the condo association will look at all building proposals. And in this case, I don't believe there's a condo association at this point for this property.
Okay, so I will mention that what the ZBA has indicated is that when they approve the project, written into the agreement or whatever the document is, there was a fixed set of plans to go along with the bedroom count that was made at that time. And any changes to those plans really have to go by the ZBA. And since this is, it's not just the finishing of a room, but I see it as the adding of an additional room. So it's, if this was all open, that would be one thing. But the addition of this room and that it has egress, so it could serve as a bedroom, is an issue, I think, for Board of Health and being consistent. But it's also an issue for ZBA because I believe they need to go back and get approval from the ZBA to add a room that was not in the original plans that were submitted. And that's based on communications that took place between members of ZBA and the building inspector and the Board of Health.
And Daryl, I just have one clarification. And I'm not confident in my recall. My recollection was that the bedroom, that a room that is clearly not a bedroom may not need to come to the ZBA. If a room looks like a bedroom, that would then need to come to the ZBA. So I think part of it is for us to say, you know, sort of, if room counting applies, we need to be 8 or more rooms. If room counting doesn't apply, then I think it's a question of, you know, is what's being added a bedroom? And does that meet the criteria that we would have for a bedroom? At least that was my reading of it, though again, I'm not confident in my reading. It was sort of,
there were two parts to it. If it didn't concern us that it could potentially be a bedroom, that was one layer, but just merely having more than one room down there when previously one room had been identified is an issue for ZBA, is how I read it. And I do believe that office could be a bedroom. I could, if we were looking at any other home in town and there was a room count issue, that could affect, I see it as affecting our interpretation of the rooms. Again, if it wasn't a 40B project.
right. And so for me, like, I think we then go to, you know, does it meet our criteria for a bed? I mean, like, I think that from a room count standpoint, at least my recollection is that we were at 6 rooms or fewer for the primary residence. Does that sound right?
Yes.
And so I think if that's right, then this would take us to room 7 and 8, which would then still be sort of out of our range for where we need to use room counting to arrive at the bedroom count. It would sort of fall within the deed restriction. I think that we still have to answer the question of, does either of these rooms constitute a bedroom using our definition? And I'm not sure that they, like, to me, it didn't look like they did, although again, I think this is a vulnerability where, you know, the idea that we can add substantial amounts of square footage and not add to the design flow feels like a vulnerability in the regulation. For example, you could consider a deed restricted 2-bedroom house with 8 rooms. They could add 2 rooms, and you can now say you went from being a 2-bedroom system to a 5-bedroom system by adding 2 rooms. And that certainly seems like a vulnerability at the intersection of the limitations related to room counting and rounding as it relates to those regulations. And I think that's a really valid issue, but I don't know if it lets us do something different here. Although I think it's also fine to kind of work to resolve that with ZBA, because I think ultimately it's a 40B and they're the sort of deciders. I think it's for us to flag and say, you know, we think this is or isn't an issue, and then potentially for ZBA to say it is or it isn't.
Right. I think often when we look at basement rooms, if they don't have windows or large enough windows for egress and for safety issues, we might not consider them a bedroom. And we've had deed restrictions associated with rooms that were very clearly a basement room, but this one has an egress. So this opens up caretaker suite, in-law suite. So I do think that office has the potential for that. Now, whether it still falls under the deed restrictions for ZBA, I do think in a way it's their call because it's a second room, whereas the original plan showed just a large unfinished room, I believe. That's what's been told to me. I haven't looked at the original plans that they based their agreement on. So I think we have to send it back to them with any comments that we might have regarding its bedroom potential. And they're the deciders on this.
Right, and I guess I'm just a little confused. Was this also was a 55 plus development? Is that correct, Daryl?
Yes. Yes.
Right. And so, like, I mean, a big selling point to the town in approving this, just as a, you know, townsperson, was that these were not going to be, you know, adding to the school, that these were going to be, you know, in general, people who are, you know, empty nesting or, you know, couples, et cetera. And so I guess, you know, not only is there that question, how does this jibe with sort of the ZBA agreements regarding this development? And then B, when I see things like playroom and office, it's just, you know, okay, well, so this seems a little bit beyond how this whole development was represented and agreed upon in terms of permitting it. And secondly, again, this is now, and like you said, Daryl, there's egress, and who's to say that it's not going to be turned into, you know, a third bedroom at some point in time, like, you know, and this is where things like just throwing a deed restriction on a piece of paper gets kind of problematic in my mind.
But also, I think the thing that it sort of lines up for both of us, Daryl, in our recollection is, you know, really this, because it's a 40B, it kind of goes back to the ZBA, and it's not so much a Board of Health question other than to surface the issue. It's then sort of up to ZBA to decide. Does that sound right to you?
Yes.
And so I think that we could essentially flag and say, you know, given this pattern of use with this sort of closed office with egress, you know, that's an issue that we think it's worth the ZBA thinking about and making a determination upon. Does that sound right as a next step?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful to them to determine if they want to make any adjustments or would allow adjustments at this point. And Peter, I see your actual hand up.
I can't get a virtual one. I'm sorry. And I don't want to interrupt, but I just didn't want you to close out your thoughts until I could speak. So you let me know when I can.
No, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to explain a few things. One, there is definitely a deed restriction on this property. There are only allowed to be 2 bedrooms. We are not exceeding 8 rooms with these additional 2 rooms. I just wanted to reiterate that for the record. The buyer of this unit wants to have a private office, so that's why this space is being created. And I was going to say another solution here would be just to not partition that or put that door in, because they're just basically partitioning off the mechanical spaces. Having been in all of these units, you know, there are sections where the heating system is located in the you know, the mechanical component of the unit. So they're just trying to create a private space outside of that. There's definitely no ulterior motive to put a bedroom here. There is a condo association. They are the members who own. They will be a very good policing authority to each other. So I can assure you there would be not another bedroom. And I want to explain also there are no windows there other than there are a couple of sliding windows. They wouldn't be deemed an egress window in these basements. And the lastly, that is a bulkhead. It's not a covered stairway other than being a bulkhead. So I guess to the extent that you can open a bulkhead and walk in and out of it, it's still an egress to that extent because you need to have another means of access out of the basement. I personally don't have a problem. Oh, I'm sorry.
There's no daylight coming in through that door.
There's no daylight coming through that door. No, it's a bulkhead. There's no glass in the door at the bottom of it either. It's a fire door, basically.
Okay.
So
right,
it definitely paints a different picture. What I was going to say is if you deemed it necessary to refer it back to the zoning board, what I would ask just for expediency, because we are trying to just finish the space, is that we could do all of the partitioning in the construction and not put the door in. It would at least allow people to keep to a schedule. And if the zoning board ruled, you know, against it, then it would just stay one big open room, which they would be allowed to do. It's by putting in the door that I think raises the specter that you're concerned about. And I can
so
just
how
assure
does
you
the
there's
rest of
nothing
the
going.
board feel about a bulkhead versus I was envisioning more of a glass door like is on some walkouts?
I mean, I guess I sort of feel like a bulkhead door and small sliding windows exactly describes the office that I have in my basement in my 8-room, 3-bedroom house. So which, you know, is not counted as a bedroom. And so I think I would be hard pressed to say that. I think also this doesn't sort of meet our other usual connections in that there isn't like a 3/4 or half bath there. You know, this is in the basement. It's not on the second floor. And so I think there are sort of lots of ways in which not calling this a bedroom would be consistent with other things we've done.
The bulkhead does change it for me, assuming it couldn't be made into some kind of really nice combo window and door exit, which it sounds like it's not really laid out for that. So, okay, but it still has to go to ZBA because it's still a change in the rooms, or it's a change from the original plans is what we were told. So we'll just kick it back to them. But the question is, do we advise them that we think it could be a bedroom or not a bedroom, but it does add to the room count, but as long as the deed restrictions to 2 bedrooms hold, how do we?
I would say, I think going to Matt's point, you know, again, I think the fact that it's a bulkhead, like it sort of feels basement-y, and that makes it easier to say it should be treated basement-y. And so I would certainly feel different for like, well, no, instead of the bulkhead, we put in French doors. You know, that feels like a different kind of space. And instead of the mechanical room, we put in a closet. Like there are lots of things that would make it feel different, but they're not there. And the fact that they're not there, I think matters. And so, you know, for me, I would say, I think it's okay for this to say, I think it does affect the room count. And I think this is a net gain of 2 rooms. But, you know, again, as long as that is 8 or fewer, then it doesn't trigger an issue with the bedroom count and it kind of passes the gut check. And I think it would. And so then this would then go to the zoning enforcement officer who would then escalate it to the ZBA or not, depending on their judgment.
Yeah. I just want to mention one thing. The presence of a closet to me is not critical to whether something is a bedroom. There are certainly antique homes that don't have closets built in. They have armoires or some other way of dealing with
If I may,
storage
to-
space. So I don't use that as a criteria. That is all I'm saying.
and if I
But
may, Daryl,
the window and daylight is important, I think, for a bedroom.
I agree. Darrow, just on the other note that DEP had indicated, Peter just noted there is a condo association in place because the applicant wasn't the condo association. Obviously, it's the builder. Has the condo association seen this, Peter, if I may, through you, Madam Chair, and have they commented if they're okay with this in writing?
Yeah, I don't know how Vin has handled I just saying there is a condo association. I'm just not sure how he's handling that administratively with the number of units that have been conveyed out. I would think that he's over 50%, so they must have some sort of structure. I just don't know what that is.
I would suggest to the.
But this wouldn't, again, we're in construction on this, so at some point they will be kind of policing themselves. But this is we're still in active construction. There's I think there's 2 more units still to convey out. So you know, he's still in responsibility of that through the various boards in the building department.
Okay, so it might not be.
How
possible.
about just noting that it's getting really late and we still have a bunch of things to take care of. We'll contact ZBA. We'll indicate that it's clearly an additional room. Again, the 8 rooms is okay if it's deed restricted to 2 bedrooms, and that room does not look like, neither of those rooms looks appropriate for a bedroom.
But we are already deed restricted. Yes,
Yes.
Yep.
But that's what they need to decide, is whether there's any other requirements to put on that. Okay. Does that sound all right to everyone? And I'll send an email.
Sounds lovely. That sounds
right.
perfect.
Sounds good to
All
me.
right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. All right, let's do food establishment permit for St. Teresa's. Do we have a motion to approve the renewal of that permit, subject to a sodium posting?
So moved. Seconded.
Any other comments? Daryl, aye.
Matt Beavers, aye.
Lisa, I.
Rebecca Honeywell, aye.
Matt Vitale, aye.
Okay, and do we have a motion to approve the renewal of the food establishment permit for Sunshine Farm?
So moved.
So moved. Second.
Other comments? Daryl, aye.
Matt Beavers, aye.
Lisa, I.
Rebecca Honeywell, aye.
Matt Vitale, aye.
Okay, and do we have a motion to renew the food establishment permit for Wild Robins Farm, also subject to sodium posting or notification?
So moved.
Seconded. Matt and I both have to get up early tomorrow.
Me too.
All right, I'll take one of those as it was a second. Any other comments? Daryl, aye.
Matt Beavers, aye.
Lisa, I.
Rebecca Honeywell, aye.
Matt Vitale, aye.
Okay, and we have the visiting nurses invoice with the extra hours for COVID. Any questions or comments?
I think it looks good, and Ellen and I met with interim coverage while our primary public health nurse is out, and they seem wonderful.
Okay, great. So do we have a motion to approve this invoice for payment?
So
Wait,
moved.
did I already approve this one, didn't I, Ellen? So this is ratifying my,
Yes, that's right.
yep, okay. To ratify my prior approval of this that I made for timeliness of payment reasons.
So moved.
Seconded.
Comments? Daryl, aye.
Matt Beavers, aye.
Lisa, I.
Rebecca Honeywell, aye.
Matt Vitale, aye.
All right. Oh, all right. Anybody have any comments on the draft guidelines for multifamily zoning? Otherwise, we could, go ahead.
I thought their comments were good and raised important issues. At the same time, I sort of, with the competing priorities, didn't have enough time to go through the primary communication in detail, but I thought that the memo that they circulated looked good, but the larger document I didn't have time to review. So I'd love to include this on our March 2nd agenda. I think they need to submit by like the 17th, so at least it gives us some time, but it seemed on the right track to me, particularly as it relates to our structures.
Okay, yep. So excellent. So that addressed part of 6, a new agenda item. Wonderful. Do we have a motion to, one, I just hope everybody got to submit their edits for the February 2nd meeting and the minutes. And if so, do we have a motion to approve the minutes as amended?
So moved.
Seconded.
Other comments? Daryl, aye.
Matt Beaver's aye.
Lisa, I.
Rebecca Honeywell, aye.
Matt Vitale, aye.
All right. We're going to move this one to the next agenda as well.
Absolutely.
It's just too late. And did we want to wrap anything up on the masks?
So I think, Daryl, we sort of had, you made some comments right before we were segueing into the 7:30, and I think I just wanted to make sure we sort of didn't cut it off, that piece of the discussion.
No, I wouldn't vote to lift any mask recommendations, but that's okay. If we're going to, do we need a vote for the purposes of the schools?
We don't for the schools, the school protocol. So I guess the school protocol doesn't require a vote of the Board of Health. It goes to the superintendent who's made her decision. I think she will communicate that to the school committees. That meeting had been scheduled for yesterday, but given the tragic death of one of the seniors, that meeting was pushed to March 1st. So we'll sort of attend and discuss, but that'll be after the 28th. And so I don't think we need to.
Okay, so we just need a vote for municipal buildings.
Well, we didn't have a mandate anyway. It was just a recommendation, correct?
Right.
We had a recommendation that the school implemented as a requirement.
No. I'm talking about the town. I heard the school. I thought.
Yeah. So I think that we, again, Jeff, and I don't see Marion anymore. My recollection is we had a recommendation that select board was then the sort of operationalizers for the mask requirement in this phase. Does that match with your recollection, Daryl and Jeff?
Yeah, I don't think it ever got up to a mandate, but
yeah,
it was a recommendation.
Yeah, and so can it then revert to the select board to sort of determine? I mean, from my standpoint, I'm agnostic and would be fine. Like, again, recognizing the differences of opinion. I think to Matt's earlier point, if not now, when? And there's some sense of trade-offs. I'd love to see us as a town and as an employer work on strategies to try to get high-performing masks for town employees who sort of have risk factors where that would be beneficial. Again, I don't know if that's a thing, and would say that's a little bit out of my lane, and would look to the select board and the town administrator for whether that's in scope or not. But from my standpoint, I think Matt's point about sort of unidirectional masking or one-way masking is not unreasonable for this phase of things, particularly in a community that has below average case rates and above average vaccination rates.
Yes, and we do have a supply of KN95s, I believe.
So I would love, if we do have, I think for me, the part that I worry about is just that, like, continuing to purchase masks is not without some cost, and the degree to which we can mitigate that cost as an employer for people carrying out their face-to-face duties is certainly appealing if it's practical. And I think it's certainly something I'd be enthusiastic to see us do as a town. But again, that's more Matt Vitale of Mill Street than Matt Vitale, Board of Health.
Well, we'll have building inspectors and everyone come to your house to get their documents. I think the issue really isn't really employees. It's all the visitors that come there, whether it's contractors or residents, you know, and that I get the point about the one-way masking that, you know, if the employees want to protect themselves, they can choose to do so. And with our vaccination rate, you know, that may be adequate. So I think the new state guidelines probably speak for themselves, but we have a pretty full agenda, but we have a select board meeting on the 24th. So we can have a COVID update there perhaps.
Okay, sounds good, Jeff.
But I'm assuming that since we've recommended masks, now the question becomes, are we not recommending masks?
So what I would say is I think masking, I think that in general, there's some discordance right now between the recommendations of Mass DPH and US CDC, where I think the US CDC and its current guidance would continue to recommend masks in general in the case rates we've been. It may be that we're just about below that. And so it's certainly possible that in the current set of data, we'll see that we're below the CDC threshold for substantial transmission, although again, they communicate it at the county level, but if you're in Wyoming, you know, you can have about as many residents in a county as we have in Dover and Sherborn. And so I think it's a little bit harder to figure out how to scale that for the eastern states. So I think it's certainly reason.
I mean, Matt, I mean, when I look at the February 15th guidance in Massachusetts, quoting from the CDC, basically said, you know, a fully vaccinated individual should wear a mask indoors if you have a weakened immune system or if you're at increased risk for severe disease because of your age or underlying medical condition or, you know, like household concerns. So they're leaving it up to the individual to make that assessment and take the precautions as necessary versus like a blanket we recommend for all people, regardless of vaccination status and age and, you know, immune sort of setting to recommend it. So I think that's a good way to keep it, is follow their lead on that.
I think it's totally fine to go to DPH. Ellen, I wasn't on the call, at least looking at the NC8 minutes that you circulated, it looks like there's still some discordance there and the CDC has not yet updated their guidance, but maybe in the process of doing so. Does that sound right to you?
Yes.
And so I think right now we're in this in-between where CDC hasn't updated it yet, but I expect that we'll see some concordance. And I think the challenge for the CDC is they're issuing guidance for all 50 states, which, you know, as Sherborn is to Massachusetts, Massachusetts is to America, where I think, you know, you're issuing guidance to places that have very, very different vaccination rates than us. So it's certainly plausible that CDC will continue to be relatively conservative compared to Massachusetts, and that in turn Massachusetts may be conservative, or that the strategy for Massachusetts, one could argue for a more liberal strategy locally, although I think that the reason we have the rates that we do is because people are really working hard to mitigate the risk. So, you know, I think the other piece is like, you know, there's a period of time when the fire alarm went off in my office thrice weekly. And God forbid if there's ever a fire, I would have burned to death. I'm glad Zach's not here to hear it, but there's a certain point that you're like, if it's going off every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm not going to listen to it when it's time to get up out of my chair. And I worry that if we have a perpetual state of caution, it makes it much harder to signal when things are actually different and we need to act accordingly. And so I think that's the other logic to say, you know, we're in a window of time where this is reasonable, and that may change and we may need to pivot. So I would support aligning with Mass DPH.
Yeah, the one caveat is Lisa's point is good. We know we have several people in town hall employees that have suppressed immune systems.
I also think that, you know, it's great that we're seeing these numbers move in the direction that they're moving. We still have quite a bit of prevalence of disease, and mass spread prevent the spread of disease. So I would encourage continuing to wear masks, you know, as long as we're mostly indoors. So I don't know. I know people don't like it, but but people also like being healthy. So I think I'm in favor of masking. So
Well, thankfully, Jeff, you guys get paid the big bucks. So good luck and God bless.
We make it up on overtime. too.
I just want to, I know, based on every other time you've discussed masks, that tomorrow when I go in the office, everyone's going to ask me, are they required to wear masks?
I would say the select board will let you know on February 24th.
So nothing has changed until,
I think it's the select board is the people who implemented it, and so they're the people to decide it.
And does that mean that things change on, what is it, March 7th officially?
Well, so for Dover, Sherborn schools, they change on March 7th. I think for municipal buildings, I would sort of leave it to the select board as the people who sort of own the last piece of it to determine what the timeline is in the other pieces.
I don't know. We're the Board of Health. I think we're supposed to advise, although I have a feeling we're going to have a split vote is my guess at the moment. But
it wasn't a requirement now, it was a recommendation. So there's a difference. Words matter, you know.
What I would say is I think we could make a vote or one might, I think there are different ways to make the vote. My personal belief is I think it is not unreasonable to align with Mass DPH guidance in the application to town buildings and municipal offices. And so I think that would continue to recommend masking for people who are unvaccinated or who have a compromised immune system or those other elements. I don't know, my personal opinion is I don't think we're in a local position where we need to exceed that guidance right now. I think it's certainly reasonable to let the select board consider and decide upon that. I think my recommendation is that on the 24th, it would be reasonable for them to align. I think the logic for the schools isn't that we need that amount of time, but it's really that artifactual impact of the school vacation week and the sort of patterns we've seen.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And if one of you could come on the 24th in case people have questions, that'd probably be helpful.
yeah, when you
it can't be both of us because I'll be saying just keep wearing masks. It makes
I mean, I think that we should
protects
as a
other
Board of Health,
people better if it's the wearer who's
you can draw
infectious.
But I would argue that
I don't know.
there's increasing data that if you have an N95, like, and I'll say this having walked into many rooms with people with COVID who weren't wearing masks, like if you have a high quality mask, it is effective if you as the uninfected person wearing a high quality mask is effective. So I just want to sort of state for the record that that is true. And I know this from going into rooms wearing an N95 with people with active COVID.
And,
right.
so,
and I guess why would we want to do something that deviates from mass DPH, you know, policy if we're on the high end of vaccination and the low end of case rates and things? I think it's you know, I would always advocate for anyone who wants to wear a mask. Obviously, that's a good thing, and I personally do choose to wear a mask. But I feel that that's different. Like I guess at this point in time, if we were recommending it when it was higher, why would we start like trying to require it when it's at a much lower incident rate with a milder variant and, you know, not consistent necessarily with DPH guidance? Like, why aren't we comfortable with following DPH guidance? I guess.
because I think it's being driven by some other things. I'm not saying require because I doubt that is ever going to be possible at the moment.
So
I'm talking more about if I was putting on the hat of what is the best guidance I would give people, I would strongly urge them to be wearing masks.
So what I might suggest is, you know, again, I think there are different sets of trade-offs, and I think again, as somebody who's also walked into rooms with COVID and so far have not gotten the Rona, like I do feel like the masks have worked well, and you know that was for us also having some extended use. I do think that I don't think this is, we're in 2019. Like I think that this is still a place where the rates in our community are meaningful and the risks are dramatically reduced. So I think Matt had mentioned this at the last meeting, but you know the infection rate fatality rate is about 10-fold lower than it was at the start of the pandemic. And so that isn't to make light of the urgency of that, but to really say, I think it's okay for us to evolve as we do it. I do think that COVID remains a risk for people who are at elevated risk of adverse outcomes. And I certainly think it would not be unreasonable or inconsistent with DPH to continue to recommend that people who are at high risk of COVID to continue to mask in public places. And I think that's entirely consistent with the guidance DPH has put out and what I expect CDC will put out. So I think that's demonstrably true. I think for people of average or low risk of COVID, it's reasonable to revert to personal choice. And I think that we may see variation within our community about what people choose to do. And that may also evolve over time. Does that kind of pass the gut check for you or for the board in general? Because again, I don't mean to make light of it, but just to say, we need to have different settings for what our situation is. And right now our situation's good. And I feel like that's a time to turn down the regulation. But I can see how reasonable people could disagree.
No, I think what you say is I think what everybody is saying is very reasonable, and follow what Mass DPH is saying, all the rest.
Perfect.
I guess I just hear a lot from the people who it makes them very uncomfortable to be in the situations. And I just want to support them. I would expect to be the lone vote if we were voting, but that's okay. I think it shouldn't be unanimous anyway, because I do think some of these decisions are being driven by other forces. And maybe it is completely reasonable and we have to get to the next phase at some point. I get all of that.
And again, Daryl, like one, I would say I think it's incumbent on all of us to vote our conscience and to say, like, what do you think is right and reasonable? I would say for me, like, I'm not just aligning because DPH is saying it, I'm also aligning because I think in my judgment of what's safe as a community member, like I don't have the same political constraints that DPH may have. Like for me, this is sort of living my life, seeing the patients, trying to think about it thoughtfully. And it's entirely possible that I'm wrong, but it's just trying to say, like, how do we balance it? And that's sort of my piece. But I think that one could arrive at the conclusion without it being politically motivated, even if that may be impactful for some parts of DPH's recommendation, or perhaps put another way, there's a level of pragmatism that is different than the level of comfort we might have as a board of health, where we sort of have a clear singular focus on how do we mitigate the risk of public harm. But I think for me, even with that focus, it's a not unreasonable requirement that doing whatever we can to facilitate mask access for those people who are responsible for their workplace environment is something that feels important.
Carol, would you like to say something?
I just want to say that I support your point of view, Daryl. I think there are a lot of older people in town who would really like to see a mask mandate at these town meetings so that they can feel more comfortable. And I count myself among them. And I also would feel like I'd like to have Board of Health being protective and not leaving it up to the select board to decide, but to, when it gets closer to the time and closely watching what the trends are, to advise the select board. So I may be missing some nuances because I know there's a lot of discussion back and forth here, but I really look to the doctors on Board of Health to provide the guidance. That's just one person's opinion.
Yeah. So I think I think I make a couple points there. One, for sort of town meeting, we are a little limited in that I think we cannot mandate masks at town meeting because we can't do something to restrict people's access to voting.
No, but in the past we've had it outside. We've had it where people are kind of segmented off. I mean, people obviously are scared about these new variants that might come around. I think right now we're in a decent position where people are starting to feel more relaxed, but who knows when the next variant comes, right?
And so I would completely agree that I think if we see a new variant that we think is more infectious or more severe, or we see case numbers go up, then we may need to pivot in that way. And I think nothing about this is for forever. I think one thing I would like to reassure people is that I understand that there's going to be a tough transition, and we're going to hit that transition at some point where people are going to feel uncomfortable about things changing that we've been doing for the past 2 years. And I totally get that. I think what I would try to do as a physician is to reassure you that looking at the numbers we have, the severity of disease we have, and the efficacy we have of wearing a mask yourself, that those are the things that drive me to think that it's okay to not require everyone to wear a mask in all circumstances, because individuals who are at higher risk have good options for protecting themselves, because we're seeing lower rates in the community and because the dominant variant at the moment is causing less severe disease. All those things go into it. If any of those things change, then I think we're in a position to change our record, or at least I would be in a position to change my opinion on this. But you know, I think no matter when we make the shift, there's going to be people that are uncomfortable. And I think I'll be uncomfortable, just to be completely honest, making that shift. But I do think we need to acknowledge the changing environment and we need to react to it. And to Matt's point, I think living in a constant state of alarm is not effective, because there will be moments when we need to be alarmed. And I think this is just not one of them.
I guess I'd just say, for me, wearing a mask is not about alarm. It's just, to me, it's so easy. But I guess I'm a different animal.
I would like to make a statement also. With all due respect, I feel it's the complete opposite of what you are saying. I think that we should mandate masks for the town meeting, because there'd be a lot of people in a small room and it's unfair to put people at
we can't,
risk.
Rebecca.
We cannot mandate masks at town meeting. We've been over that multiple times.
It's illegal.
I would like to make a statement, and you can speak when I'm done. I think that it is public health interest to recommend masking. People are not prevented from from voting by wearing a mask, but you might be actually putting people at creating true public health risk by not wearing a mask. And because we know we're going to have a high density of people in a small space, that's a public health argument for recommending masks. All I'm saying is my opinion. That's my opinion. We don't agree. I think it's great to lean on the DPH for other spaces, but I think for town meeting, it's clear that it's a risk. And that's why I'm an MD, because I spent every single day representing the public health interests of my patients, and different people do different things and feel a different way, and it's totally fine. But I think masking is our response, encouraging masking at a town meeting and guiding the select board, who have very little, who want us to guide them, would be helpful for the town. And I think that it would make a lot of the elderly, immune suppressed, and unusually at-risk people who we don't know about feel better. I would rather be cautious and be safe rather than sorry. I mean, I think that's kind of what we're supposed to be encouraging until we have more ability to do things outdoors, or to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We know the immunity only lasts for a few months with the boosters. We know we have a percentage you can catch the disease in spite of being fully vaccinated. I mean, we all know this. So I just think that it would be smart to have something that's extra cautious rather than under cautious for the town meeting. That's my opinion.
And I'd like to just comment that I think some people will not go to I think some people will not go to town meeting. Carol, they're going to be concerned.
Carol, we just need to do it. So again, Rebecca, you said two different things. You said mandating and encouraging. Those are dramatically different. Legally, we cannot mandate a mask. We can certainly say we would encourage or we'd recommend masking, or we do those things, but you said two different things in your comment. And just for the purposes of clarity, we are legally not allowed to mandate masking. We certainly can recommend masking. I think that the question at hand is the handling of municipal buildings. And again, I just want to be clear, I have spent the last 2 years walking into rooms with COVID. I certainly know what it looks like. I certainly take it seriously. The decisions I'm making represent my values and my judgment, and they may be wrong, but the idea that it's abrogating public safety, I don't think is based in fact. I think it's totally natural to be uncomfortable. I think it's inaccurate to say these are really dangerous and unreasonable choices to make, or that making a decision like this is not in keeping with the public health or the public interest. I think it is dismissive of the point of view of folks who've spent a lot of time and energy trying to thoughtfully engage on these topics in a variety of forums, whether it's inpatient care, directly caring for patients with COVID, or working to set policy in our town.
Yeah, right. I know. I get it. We should have a vote.
So, but I think I want to be clear that I think the question at hand is about municipal buildings, not town meeting.
We're not talking about town meeting.
I said the town offices. I said town offices.
You said town meeting.
Right, yes, and I said town meeting, Lisa, when I spoke, and right now I said town office. You can listen to the recording. I just said.
Okay,
town
that's
office.
fine. So I think no more discussion on town meeting at the moment, also because that's a little further away and we may be in a different environment. So I think the question for right now is what are we going to do about town offices? And so it seems to me that we don't have like since we didn't require it, we can't vote to rescind it or not.
Yeah.
We could vote on whether we want to recommend that we follow DPH guidance, and we could either vote that up or down. So I think we just have to decide, do we want to have a motion that, I mean, I think the way we could approach this is someone could recommend that we recommend universal mask in town hall and we vote that up or down, or we could recommend that to the select board that we follow DPH guidance regarding select individuals recommending select individuals masking.
I favor the latter.
I do too.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess I would move, if I can make the motion, I would move that we recommend a select board that for the purposes of municipal buildings, we follow DPH guidance regarding masking.
Second.
Okay.
So
And
now do
then
we
is there
vote?
discussion? Well, I think, is there any discussion by the board? So Daryl or Rebecca, any other comment?
Yeah,
concerns?
I completely understand the rationale for it. I'm not completely opposed to it. But I'm going to say this, I'm just going to vote against it.
Totally
Only
fine.
because
That's
I
your
want
right.
to represent
That's your
kind
right.
of another
Yeah.
point of view. I get that nobody wants to do it. People are tired, blah, blah, blah. I understand it all. But
I think that's totally fine, Daryl, and I appreciate you kind of standing up for your point of view. Rebecca, any other comments or thoughts from you before we vote on the
I
motion?
think the only thing I think we should require is, I agree with following DPH guidance, except I personally think it would be better to be safe and sorry. And in the municipal buildings, I would strongly encourage mask wearing. Continue to do that.
well, the other part of it is people aren't doing it in town hall or in our municipal buildings anyway. So, but in any case, Daryl, nay.
Matt Beavers, yes.
Lisa, yes.
I guess I'll say nay. Thanks.
Matt Vitale, yes.
Okay.
Okay, so should I send the interim town administrator a memo stating this and suggest that it be taken up at the select board meeting on the 24th? I mean, everybody's going to ask me tomorrow. Nobody's wearing them anyway.
I mean, I think it's certainly fine and reasonable to send the memo to reflect the discussion tonight. Jeff, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's good to send it. You know, it probably won't answer the questions you're going to get. You might want to call in sick tomorrow.
You know what? Just email anybody or post the DPH guidance and don't spend any other time on it.
I wouldn't spend a lot of time, but maybe forward the DPH guidance just to the interim town administrator and just say that the board of health voted, you don't even have to record the vote, just say voted in favor of supporting the DPH guidance, which I think still recommends masks. It you know, doesn't necessarily require them, but I don't view it as a huge change. And I think one of the other points that Matt Beavers made earlier too is the greater availability of higher quality masks has changed since a year and a half ago also, so that, you know, more people can have an N95.
And it'll be a great experiment to see what happens, which might have wonderful outcome. Okay. I'm going to ask then for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Seconded.
Daryl, I.
Matt Beavers, aye.
Lisa, I.
Rebecca Honeywell, aye.
Matt Vitale, aye. Have a good night, guys.
Thanks
Good
for
night.
giving me my money tonight, guys. See you later.